Okay, so we'll start. My name is Dr. Laurie Mazurek. I'm coming to you from Moose Factory in northern Canada. Welcome to the webinar on COVID personal impacts and how we can think about forming a global healthcare team by using the impact of COVID, which has connected us all. First, I'd like to give thanks to the Canadian Association of Emergency Medicine and CAPE, Emergency Physicians, and the World Association of Disaster and Emergency Medicine, as well as University of Toronto Emergency Medicine for making the time available for their residents to attend this webinar. Your team is consistent of myself, that's me, the host, Dr. Laurie Mazurek. I'm an emergency medicine physician and critical care transport physician out of Toronto, Canada. I'm currently on a one-year leave of absence from my clinical work in Sunnybrook Health Science Centre in Toronto and working exclusively in Indigenous and Northern communities in Northern Canada. My co-host and backup is Dr. Noor Khatib, who's also an emergency physician from the Toronto area who has spent a great deal of time also working in Indigenous communities and very remote communities in Nunavut and Northwest Territories. She'll be handling the QA, or if my internet should break down, she'll take over the introduction duties in session 1. Dr. Greg Chiatone is the chair for session 2. He's the president of the World Association of Disaster and Emergency Medicine and the director of the Disaster Medicine program at Harvard. So he has a lot more I can tell you about him, and I'll introduce him further in session 2. Technical support is supplied by Jeff Allen, and I hate to say this, but none of us have actually done this webinar, but I would think we're pretty confident that we can pull this off. So bear with us if we have any glitches, but hopefully we won't. This is just the sunrise here where I am right now in Moose Factory, which is in Northern Ontario. It is a Moose Cree First Nation community, very beautiful. I can see why people are attracted to working in the northern communities, but that's another webinar on a project I'm working on called the Stronger Project. This webinar is being recorded. By continuing to be in the meeting, you are consenting to be recorded. The importance of that is that there are many people who would like to have attended but can't because of working and other conflicts of commitments. It's also important that we will be recording the chat and the questions because we're not sure that we will be able to get through all of them in this session, but we will pass them on to panelists afterward and give you the results of further discussion. About the webinar. So webinars are not the same as meetings. Attendees are muted and videos are off, but you can send questions via QA and chat. So we will be monitoring those and picking select questions from those for our speakers. The schedule is extremely tight. Introductions will be very brief and probably emphasize the accomplishments of the speakers, and trust me, they are very well accomplished. But the important thing is the messages and ideas they want to share. Questions will be saved to the end of each session. We won't get to all of them, like I said, but we are recording everything and we will share the questions with the panelists afterwards so they can further reflect on the questions that you provide, and we'll follow up with you on the answers and other sorts of things that arise as a result of this webinar. We really hope, and you can tell maybe by the makeup of this, the people on this webinar, that this will be the start of further discussion and collaboration on how to build better global teams, to include learners, and also to protect and support learners who may be put in a position of a lot of responsibility, and to ensure that they are properly supported, in addition to the staff who also find themselves in situations they're not used to managing. So session 1, we'll start with Alex Liu from China, a medical student of all places I met in a forum on the American Association of Emergency Physicians talking about COVID. So Alex, if you can share your slide presentation, and I will do the introduction.
Yeah.
Okay, and okay, so Alex Liu is a second-year medical student from Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou. China. He's expected to graduate in 2024. Now, Alex is only 19 and second year medicine. And so he's very young, very accomplished at a very young age. He received his ACLS certification and a diploma in disaster and emergency or disaster response and emergency management from FEMA when he was only 17 years old. He serves on multiple discussion groups related to trauma and emergency medicine. And when COVID-19 struck, he and others connected across the world to learn more. As a result, using WeChat, similar to Facebook, and Ding Yang Yisheng, another social media source, he and others are able to share research articles across China and further. And all of these articles shared achieved 1,000 views within a few hours, and 2 reached 1 million in just a few days. So Alex will talk about his experience as a young medical student in China, what it felt like, China's approach to containment, and how he and others use social media to collaborate and share information. So Alex, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie, for the introduction part. I am Alex Lu. I came from China. I was born in a big city called Shenzhen, which is just next to Hong Kong, if you are familiar with that. And I am currently a second-year medical student in a major medical school here in mainland China. And I serve as a consultant for leading medias in mainland China. And I am interested in resuscitation science, toxicology, and trauma care. So from my perspective, I would like to talk about my personal experience during first wave. So to my knowledge, I think the first wave for mainland China is about January to February 2020. And it happened to be the winter holiday from school. And it was also the Chinese New Year and Spring Festival time. I remember months earlier, like in 2019, August of 2019, it was my 18th birthday, and a friend of mine asked me what did I would like to have for my birthday present, and I said I would like a box of N95 respirators from 3M company, which became extremely valuable during the pandemic months later. And as you can see, that was like my doorway during the pandemic. You can see there's a lot of N95 respirators, surgical masks, and goggles or protective eyewear, and a lot of used respirators because there weren't enough respirators at that time. And at that time, besides living my life as a citizen to stay at home to do own responsibility, I also serve as a writer for social media. So I was a contributing writer and an advisor for several major medias in mainland China, and we talk about general protection and prevention measures for the public and how to properly use PPEs for the healthcare workers. And I wrote tens of articles with 100,000 views, and 3 of them have achieved over 1 million views, which is extremely popular on the social media of China. But what I would like to talk about is at that time, there weren't enough published evidence about protection or prevention. Like, should we be wearing masks at that time? And that remains a problem. And I noticed a lot of guidelines published at that time, like from World Health Organization and US CDC. They wouldn't recommend using masks for the public, because they think that there is not enough evidence to make expert to make that recommendations. But I think that we should think about the question ourselves. Like, when there is no lack of evidence, will that procedure or that maneuver be considered wrong? And I think now many organizations, including WHO and US CDC, advise people to wear a mask in addition to social distancing. And I think there are more published researches that verify the importance of wearing mask in public areas. And I think that's very meaningful, and that reminds us of what we might have been doing wrong. So now in China, our public direction is like you have to wear a mask when taking the public transport and when you go into some places extremely, especially for those indoors facilities like shopping malls or like school classrooms. And I believe China is the first country to suggest citizens to wear masks in the public. And on the second topic, I would like to talk about the fever clinics in China. I think fever clinic in China was first established after SARS, which happened to take place in 2003. And these measures or these facilities were reinforced during COVID-19, which happened mainly in 2020. And so the setting of fever clinic actually separates fever patients and with normal patients without fever or contact with confirmed or suspicious cases. And now most 24/7 ER or ED in China have the fever clinic. In fever clinic, they have separate registry, CT room, consulting room, observation room, and etc. And here I present several photos of fever clinic in China, which is the fever clinic of the University of Hong Kong Shenzhen Hospital, and this is the fever clinic, but it's at a flu clinic, which is because the COVID-19 symptoms might be similar to flu or common cold. I think there are huge benefits from setting fever clinic in emergency rooms because it significantly reduces the nosocomial infection and protect our patients and healthcare workers. But there can also be negative sides due to some policies and due to some practice parts. Because now in a lot of fever clinics, it is compulsory for patients to receive complete blood count, Chastity, RT-PCR, which actually draw concern about abuse or misuse or overdiagnosing. And I think that we can do better on that to limit the use of invasive procedure like Chastity. But also, I would like to present you with some data about the medical fees in mainland China. Here, I list some typical charging items that may be required for COVID or flu patients, which you can see that the price in China, the medical fees in China is extremely low compared with the price of United States normal price. And if you don't have insurance, you can do all of that, including an ER visit, Chastity, SARS-CoV-2 RT-PCR, complete blood count, SARS-CoV-2 antibody serum test in under $100. And you can't imagine that in most emergency rooms in the United States. And with Chinese medical insurance, the price will be much lower. So the data was derived from a major emergency department from a leading academic hospitals in China. And also, I would like to talk about the COVID-19 patients flow. Once identified or considered suspicious infections, patients will be transferred to fever clinic or further investigation, including repetitive RT-PCR and Chastity scans. Once confirmed, patients will be transferred to a designated treatment center, which is designated during the pandemic. For example, in Shenzhen, there is one designated treatment center which specializes in treating infectious diseases, and it is a major general hospital here. Transport will be using negative pressure ambulance, so it won't put much pressure on the normal ambulance service. And also, For those non-COVID-19 patients admitted to inpatient ward, Chastity RT-PCR are usually required. Some hospitals only require RT-PCR. And for major trauma or STEMI patients or etc., which is like some acute or patients who need immediate intervention, they will use Chastity only to speed up the process. And also, there's something we like to call testing on demand. Patients come to hospital or reference lab for on-demand RT-PCR tests, and the results will be reported in 24 hours. Normally, people who came for testing on-demand service, they would like to test for the coronavirus, not because they have shown symptoms of coronavirus infection. They actually, some traveling or schools or companies, local governments will make policies to require negative results on it. So people will have to do it sometimes ahead of traveling to another city. At last, I would like to talk about myself. As people can see, that China, especially mainland China, has contained and controlled the coronavirus to a very great degree, that we can live a much normal life compared to the life in January or February 2020. So I just spent my Spring Festival or Chinese New Year with my family members and relatives and friends 10 days ago. We got to dine out, and I got to get back to the gym, and I got to do some domestic traveling. Here I show you a picture of the restaurant where we can dine out and eat out. And here is, I wouldn't post family members' photos, so I just post products from Lego company, which shows the festival of Chinese New Year. And here I present a photo of me when spending holidays in a hotel. So I would like to conclude my presentation. So the first part I would like to I talked about the lack of evidence. Like when there is no public evidence and there is no one we can believe, who should we believe and what should we do? And the second topic is the benefits of control, is to have a normal life. I think to control something, by all means, by all costs, it definitely has some negative sides, but there will also be significant great sides about it, because you can live a normal life, and the deaths from the virus or from the virus related reduction of medical service will be much lower. And it's great for the healthcare system, so they can deal with these problems. And the third part is the modification of healthcare workflow to protect patients and staff. I think we all know that Western countries or Eastern countries, they have relatively different healthcare systems, but we can all learn from each other's experience, like setting a fever clinic or setting separate wards to treat suspicious or confirmed cases. And in doing so, we can significantly reduce the chance of in-hospital infection. Yeah, so that's my presentation, and thank everyone for listening to my poor English. So my name is Alex Lu, and if you would like to contact me, you can write emails to me. Thanks, Lori, for having me. Yeah, that's a wrap.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alex. Your English is fantastic. And Theresa, if you can share your screen while I do your introduction. Yeah. So Dr. Theresa Esposito in Canada, we would say Esposito because those of us are old enough know of the Esposito brothers who played hockey. She's a resident in anesthesia and intensive care in Novara, Italy. She's currently working in cardiac anesthesia and intensive care. She actually lived for a year with my husband and our family in Toronto while she was doing research on ARDS and complaining about non-Italian pizza. But Theresa, we did give you good Graham, my husband, pizza. She would like someday to complete her education with a PhD. And during wave 1, she left Toronto in January, and we were keeping in touch through email. And I remember sending her an email and said, Theresa, have you guys heard about this? You know, have you thought about protected code blue? And I think that the thing is, oh, it won't come. I'm not actually sure where all the N95s is, but we're told not to worry. So she's going to tell you about her experience working as a critical care resident in the COVID units in Novara, Italy. Dr. Theresa Esposito.
Thank you, Lori, for your introduction. So hi, everybody. I'm just going to be very quick about my experience, and it's going to be very less structured than Alex's. But so, as you may know, Italy has been deeply hit by COVID, especially during wave 1. I live in the northern part of Italy, 100 kilometers far from Milan. That has been the worst region regarding COVID incidents. But we have been pretty bad too, because by now we had around 20,000 cases and 3,000 deaths. So even saying these numbers out loud still feels unbelievable, but it really happened and we went through it. Anyway, every time I think about COVID, this is the picture that comes to my mind, because was exactly how I felt a year ago. I knew that there was this big thing coming. It felt far, but I knew it was threatening and coming, and everybody was just panicking about it. Also because we were constantly submerged by information, conflicting information, because somebody was saying it's just a flu, not to worry about it. Somebody was saying it's going to be terrible. Somebody was saying it's just something invented by somebody in laboratories. And we just didn't know what to do. I remember some CT scans images shared by my colleagues on my WhatsApp group. And I was like, we were like, oh my God, what are we gonna do with this? Because they look terrible. And we had never seen anything like that before. So what happened was that, so just to show you what happened and how everything escalated very quickly. This is an email that Lori sent to me on February 22. And she was like, guys, you're going to get hit with the outbreak. And I was like, yeah, I know. It is concerning. We were scared. We didn't really know what to do. Everybody was trying to, adapt to it and find something, but we didn't really know what to expect. And I also have to say that I was not at my best mental condition, because as Lori said, I had just come back from Canada, and I was trying to readjust to medical life, and I was feeling already under pressure a lot, because I was trying to settle in back to my job. So COVID came when I was kind of weaker than I am, and it didn't really help. I was imagining it was going to be bad, but I couldn't imagine it would be that bad, because it was bad. What happened was that as soon as we got hit, it was kind of at the end of February, soon after this email, it was kind of obvious that we were not ready at all. Like, we didn't know simply how to wear PPE. We didn't know how to isolate patients. We didn't really know what to do. I remember like at the beginning, I just intubated a patient with no mask or anything, because I was like, oh my God. And then I realized I had to do something. We had to do something about it. We didn't really know what to do. Everything was so chaotic. People kept coming, people with symptoms, without symptoms. We didn't really know what to do, and no protocol was really established. So, and also a lot of people started getting sick. So we soon ran out of everything. Like, there were no PPEs, there were not enough beds for people. There were no nurses, there was no staff, because everybody got sick. A lot of people got sick. So we didn't really know how to cover the shifts. So what happened, it was really, really quickly. And what happened was that our hospital decided to hire residents, anesthesia residents, from the 4th and 5th year, our last years of residency, to try to cover the shift into these new COVID wards. So we opened a new ICU, we opened a new sub-intensive care. And I decided to accept work into these new COVID wards, because first, I mean, I was a lot uncertain about my capabilities to do something, but I also wanted to kind of challenge myself in doing that. I thought it could help me getting back to clinical work, but I also wanted to have really, but that was a kind of a nightmare. Yeah, I have to say this. So I started working into COVID ICU and especially sub-intensive care. And that was the worst because at the beginning of it, we were not very well organized. Everything was sort of new. The staff was new. The staff was not always trained, not used to intensive care. So, for example, like nurses didn't really know what to do. It was not anybody's fault. That was the staff, that were the people. But it was, everything was kind of frustrating at the beginning. People kept coming, a lot of severely sick people that needed help. And there were people that didn't even know how to assemble a CPAP helmet. One of the first shift I did, we didn't even have monitors, like 30, 35 patients on a floor. And I remember myself going up and down the floor all night with just a pulse oximeter in my hand and trying to understand who was sicker than the others, who was dying and who wasn't, because I didn't have anything else. I found, like, there are some images that still give me the chills, even if I talk about it right now. For example, I found patients that were almost suffocating into their CPAP helmets because the oxygen demand was so high on the entire floor that oxygen was not enough to keep the flow into the helmet. So that was the thing. It was just terrible. I have no other word to say that. I felt like I was at war. And yeah, so like kind of a month later, this is some answers that I gave Laura after an email she sent to me. She was like, "How are you? How's it going?" I was like, "This is terrible." I think that this was the peak of my kind of depression. So she asked me to share my answer to her question, and I think I became kind of famous, joking, but that's what it felt. I really felt like I couldn't do that because I found myself taking decisions that were way bigger than me. I felt just like a resident, as I am. And at some point, I found myself deciding who could leave and who couldn't, because I had to choose between people to send them into ICU. And if at the beginning it was kind of easier, if it can ever be, because, just elderly could not be admitted. We had to choose for the younger patients. At some points, ICU was full of younger patients, like 40 years old, 50 years old. I just felt I was hopeless and helpless, and I was so sad. I remember just going home after every shift and be like, I cannot do this anymore. I'm not able to do that. I felt totally inadequate to what my tests were. I kept thinking of every decision I made, everything that I had to choose, every therapy I prescribed, everything was so heavy on me. There were times where I could share my decisions with senior intensivists, but everybody was so busy at that time. So I could not be supervised every time, right? So I really find myself doing something that was way bigger than me. And for the first time, I was alone. But it had a very big emotional impact on me and still has. Talking about it still wakes up something. So I was really depressed, and at some point I used to have bad nightmares every day. I had also very bad thoughts. I felt like I couldn't do this job. I wanted to leave residency. I'm on my last year, but I wanted to leave it because this was too much for me. I kept crying. At some point, all right, I know it feels strange, but the peak just passed. I remember that everything just became a kind of a routine. Like I woke up, I went to work, I wore my PPEs, and I kept doing stuff, just kept going. I mean, life keeps going. I had to stay strong and do that. Could not do much. But it also got easier because at some point around April and May, the pressure on the healthcare system lowered a lot. Also because a lot of people died. That's the thing. A lot of the wards were empty because people were not there anymore. But yeah, I think I survived. And also I learned a lot. Spring came in, everything just felt less heavy than it was. I felt less stress. Everything was not as frustrating as it used to be. But at some point, I just needed a break, and I asked to be moved to another hospital to do something else. So I moved to the cardiac anesthesia unit into another hospital. But it really helped me because, of course, I mean, I was emotionally hit by the entire thing, but I also grew up a lot. I learned a lot of stuff. I learned war medicine because that was like, it was like being at war. But yeah, I found my new passion. I'm currently working in cardiac anesthesia unit. This is me kind of a few weeks ago. About a year later, it still feels so close, but a year has passed. So yeah, I just wanted to tell you that it's possible to do that. It's for sure something that made me learn a lot. I definitely got stronger. It has a big impact on me. I cannot deny that, but I survived. And yeah, we're almost going to be into third wave. I don't even know if we got out of the second one. But everything, as I told you, just became more of a routine. So we kind of know what to do now. And I just hope that we can survive the third wave and be not that stressed as we were on the first time. And I think that's it for me. Thank you everybody for listening to this small thing.
Thank you so much, Theresa. I know how hard that was for you to share, and means a lot, I think, to everybody on the call to hear your feelings and your honesty, and I really appreciate that. So thank you again. So Jeff Allen is going to put up Kirsten Johnson's video. Kirsten Johnson is the president of the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians. She's also an associate professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at McGill University and practices at the hospitals in Montreal. She works in the Cree and Inuit communities of Nunavut, and she's trained with over 33,000 professionals at WHO, the UN partner agencies, emergency medical teams, and academic institutions and humanitarian organizations. She has a very long and fantastic CV. So I can't spend all the time on that because I want to give the time to her presentation. This is taped because she's currently working in Burkina Faso, a conflict zone in West Africa, where she's teaching field trauma management to local clinical staff. She sends her regrets because she's in the field and she wasn't sure about the stability of the internet. So she is recorded on her phone, and her combined with PowerPoints, her experience in Beirut's COVID unit for us. So Dr. Kirsten Johnson, and I'll hand it over to you, Jeff.
Hello, my name is Dr. Kirsten Johnson, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at McGill University. I am also the president of the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians, and it's very exciting. It gives me great pleasure to be part of this wonderful panel presenting to you today. And so thank you to Dr. Mazurek and to all of my colleagues who are on this panel. It's a great privilege to do this with you. So I've been asked to speak on my work in Beirut, just before I get into that, I thought I'd just give you a tiny bit of background. My area of practice is emergency medicine, but I do a lot of work in global emergency medicine around the world. And in fact, I'm on a sabbatical year this year from my job in the emergency department at McGill to do just that. And right now I'm pre-recording this presentation from Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, where I'm working for the United Nations. And I spent September and October of 2020 in Beirut, working for the United Kingdom's emergency medical team. Slide 2. So my job with the UK EMT was to help the people of Lebanon. I was one of a team of 10 experts, and my area was, of course, emergency medicine and intensive care. But we also had people on our team from infection prevention and control, intensive care, intensive care nursing, water, sanitation, hygiene, also known as WASH, logistics, risk communications, and coordination. And we were deployed following an urgent request from the WHO in Lebanon and based on the recommendations by the UK Health Assessment Team. This team was deployed shortly after the Beirut blast in August and found that there was less of a need for a blast response than there was a need for COVID response. So our aim was to support the World Health Organization as it coordinated this internal response, and by doing so to assist at 4 public hospitals that were not only in Beirut but also in Saida, which is in the south of the country. Right now, slide 3, there are 6.8 million Lebanese in Lebanon and around 18 million Lebanese outside of Lebanon, which is huge. And there might even be less people in Lebanon now because a lot of people have left due to the economic collapse and political upheaval, the blast, and now COVID. It's a very difficult and complex humanitarian emergency. Just to give you a bit of background, Lebanon has 18 religious communities. 40% of the Lebanese people are Christians, and this is actually the highest percentage of Christians in all of the Arab countries. Compared to Canadian standards, Lebanon is very small. It is only about 10,000 square kilometers, and it takes about 4 hours to drive from the top to the bottom. But despite its size, slide 4, Lebanon remains the country hosting the largest number of refugees per capita, with government estimates of about 1.5 million Syrian refugees and some 20,000 refugees of other origins, plus the 500,000 Palestinian refugees who have been there for the last 70 years. So this overcrowding and lack of access to proper medical care has put the populations of refugees, migrants, and others at increased risk of COVID-19. And it's a very challenging situation. Also, slide 5, unlike many Arab countries, Lebanon is not dominated by one ruler, but has a number of leaders and sort of a party-sharing agreement. And so positions are apportioned by quotas among 18 officially recognized sects. So it's a lot of people involved with a lot of their own interests, and it makes it a challenge to come to some consensus. Parliament is half Christian and half Muslim, and the Prime Minister must be a Sunni Muslim, the President a Maronite Christian, and the Speaker of Parliament a Shiite. Slide 6. On October 17th, 2019, there was the first of a series of mass civil demonstrations, which were initially triggered by planned taxes on gasoline, tobacco, and online phone calls, such as WhatsApp, but these quickly expanded into a countrywide condemnation of sectarian rule, stagnant economy, unemployment, endemic corruption in the public sector, and failures from the government to provide basic services such as electricity, water, and sanitation. So as a result of all of these protests, Lebanon entered a political crisis. The Prime Minister resigned. And unfortunately, I don't think even until now that they've got somebody who has stepped in to take charge, and protests and acts of civil disobedience have since continued. And subsequently, Lebanon is facing the worst economic crisis in decades. Now, add to that the Beirut blast that happened on August 4th of 2020 in the port of Beirut, which is Lebanon's main port. Unfortunately, this blast was so massive that it destroyed all of the surrounding areas. It killed more than 200 people and injured thousands more. The cause of the explosion was later determined to be 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate that had been unsafely stored and accidentally set on fire that Tuesday afternoon. So the medical students actually that I worked with, that I taught in one of the hospitals, were part of this response. It involved pretty much every health professional that was in the city of Beirut at the time, and all of Beirut's hospitals that had to take over 5,000 patients that were routed to them. In the end, over 300,000 people were displaced, and many people have since left Beirut and just not returned. Slide 8. Our team was based in Ashrafia, and as you can see, this is really one of the epicenters, one of the epicenter of the blast. And so many buildings there are still destroyed and empty, and glass is shattered. And even, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the damage done by the blast or the past civil wars. So it's, or wars with Israel and ongoing conflicts. So it's really historically, recent history has been very challenging for Beirut and Lebanon. Slide 9. Now with the destruction of Beirut's port, unfortunately, there's also been the destruction of the main grain silo. As you can see, the Beirut blast happened right in front of the grain silo, which ended up acting as a protective barrier to the city. But unfortunately, it destroyed the stocks of all of the city's grain, and bread is a staple for the Lebanese people. So that's been another challenge that they've had to face. Slide 10. So a humanitarian emergency response was quickly activated after the blast to address the immediate needs of the affected populations, and the United Nations and its humanitarian partners launched a flash appeal to mobilize nearly $565 million in assistance for a target population of 300,000 people for their immediate and medium and long-term needs, including needs for psychosocial support, basic assistance, and recovery and reconstruction. And so that's where we come in. But before I get into what we were doing there, I just want to backstep for a second and just speak briefly about the Emergency Medical Teams initiative, which really came into play in about 2010, 2011. There was already something called Foreign Medical Teams, but after the Haiti earthquake, which saw a lot of these teams deployed, the World Health Organization put a line in the sand, and they said that there could be no more medical tourism, because unfortunately what happened in Haiti was that the humanitarian response saw a worse outcome from the response itself than from the earthquake. There were over 3,000 hospitals, non-governmental organizations, universities, and other institutions that sent teams to Haiti to respond, but many of these were untrained. For the vast majority, it was their first response, and a lot of them were under the age of 30. We had resident physicians doing field amputations when they had never even done an amputation in the operating room, and so forth. So the outcry from basically the world was that this couldn't happen again, and so the Emergency Medical Teams initiative was born, and since then there's been standards put in place, and teams have to be vetted to take part in an international response. And so I was part of one of those teams. Slide 12. The UK government's Emergency Medical Team, which is also known as UKEMT, is a rapid medical response unit, and it's funded by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and classified by the WHO as a proper EMT. It can deploy at 72 hours notice to provide essential health care, to save lives and alleviate suffering all around the world. It also delivers training for local medical teams in countries vulnerable to health crises to increase preparedness. Canadian equivalents would be DMAT and CMAT. Slide 13. So our team worked in 4 public hospitals. We worked in the corona units, both intensive care and step-down kind of wards, and emergency departments. I should mention that 20% of Lebanon's hospitals are public, and they were the ones that were initially given the baton. They were given the responsibility to handle all of the COVID patients in Lebanon. Now the private hospitals have stepped in because the World Health Organization has been very implicated in getting them involved and to help build capacity for the public hospitals. But initially, the public hospitals had to take ownership of all the COVID patients, and so they really weren't not only physically set up to do so, but the staff didn't have proper training, they didn't have personal protective equipment, and they didn't certainly have enough medications and ventilation support. There was no high flow oxygen and so forth. So they needed to sort of scramble and get on top of this very quickly, and that was what we came to help them with. Slide 14. So we worked certainly in emergency department design, hospital layout, and patient flow. We basically helped hospitals to lay out the pathway that patients would take if they were hot or cold, and how they would flow not only through the emergency department but through the hospital system up into the wards. So that involved administration and a lot of meetings with nursing and doctors and staff and so forth. And from there, we also designed a lot of standard operating procedures that help to provide the guidelines in terms of how to manage these kinds of patients. And so I took a lot of this from World Health Organization materials and adapted it for the local context, because of course, as I mentioned before, they might not have even had the medications that we would have seen as very easy and standard in most countries. Because of the economic and political crisis, they were very hard to get. So it was really quite a challenge to function in this system that was also changing. It almost felt like day to day. I mean, some days there would be this medication and some days there wouldn't be. Some days you could get a blood gas and some days you couldn't. So even working in terms of frontline patient care had its unique challenges in this context. Slide 15. We also did a lot of training on infection prevention and control with all levels of staff, from cleaners to security guards, nursing, and so forth, and training in donning and doffing, proper use of personal protective equipment, and how to clean rooms and so forth. Slide 16. We set up emergency departments for flow, as I mentioned, for COVID-19 patients, and we did training on ED with ED staff on how to assess and triage and manage these patients. Slide 17, one of my favorite parts was the risk communication and capacity building we did with other organizations such as Médecins Sans Frontières and UNICEF. We went out and we worked with community members to educate them on infection prevention and control and risk communication, like, the very basic stuff like how to wear a mask, wash hands, this kind of thing. So that was fun, and I felt like it was something that really made a difference. And then slide 18, we were also involved in the clinical care of patients. Now, we couldn't actually get medical and nursing licenses to practice because of the way, it was just a difficult system to function in. So we did a lot of advisory capacity building. I worked with doctors and did a lot of teaching for them and rounding and just being beside them as they would round with their patients in the intensive care unit and on wards. And we also brought in our own personal protective equipment, of course, because they had shortages, so we didn't want to use theirs. So this was our PPE that arrived actually from Kuwait, and it's the first time that I've seen what I call Desert Storm style PPE that was sand colored and pretty made for very small people. I don't know if that's the case over there, but it was kind of this mini PPE. Slide 19. And it was interesting because this was the typical PPE that was used in the intensive care units, which you can see is kind of overkill, but there's a lot of stigma around caring for COVID patients, especially those that were on BiPAP and had a lot of expulsion of viral particles due to use of, they didn't have Optiflow, so certainly everybody was on BiPAP or intubated for the most part. So the nurses would get dressed in this Tyvek stuff and from head to toe be covered in PPE and do a round of on their patients and then doff their PPE. It was the way they figured out how to deal with the shortage, at the same time get in there to see all their patients. Slide 20. So, as I mentioned before, a big challenge was the lack of supplies, equipment, and medications. Also, the physical setup was not really set up to handle COVID patients, and so we really were dealing with kind of MacGyvering these physical layouts and trying to figure out how to adapt to this local context with these very sick patients that had a lot of needs in regards to patient care. So if I had to summarize some of the challenges that we faced, I would say for sure it was very difficult to insert ourselves into a system. It wasn't like we were doing our own project where we had our own hospital and we could set our own standards and we could do it the way that we have been trained to do it in our own centers back at home in Canada. We had to insert ourselves into a system that was under-resourced and under-managed, and the doctors and nurses hadn't been paid for months, and so there was a lot of diminished staff morale, and people were exhausted, and then also kind of demoralized because there was a lot of deaths, and that was very difficult. It was hard to see patients in this sort of the situations that they were in because of all of the challenges of the system. And then there was cultural differences. I was a woman working with mostly male doctors in Lebanon, and so that was hard for me because of they didn't want to listen to me some of the time, and some of the time I really objected to how they would practice, and so changing culture and changing practice is not an easy thing to do either. And then there was many stakeholders involved and a lot of bureaucracy, and working in a system like that that's faced so many challenges as it is was also difficult. Slide 21. And then, of course, working as part of a team is never easy. And although we look very happy here, which we were, that was at the end of the mission. And so certainly people know, I'm sure you've heard about forming, storming, norming, and performing, but we definitely went through all of those classic stages of becoming an efficient team. And even though we were doctors and nurses and sort of knew what our jobs were, we hailed from different places of the globe, and we had sort of different approaches and personality types, and so certainly there was some tension, and but realizing that this is a normal part of a team and that communication is key, and also that leadership is key. Having a leader that can help keep the team focused on the mission at hand, and keeping communication open and transparent is important. But then also knowing yourself is super important. Knowing when you need time by yourself, when you should pull out and just say, I need tonight on my own, and knowing the things that you need for your own self-care. Exercise is very important. I always travel with a yoga mat and yoga blocks and my tennis racket. But that could be also books or Netflix or whatever it is that you need. And then also a support system, both in the field and at home. You need people to talk to, because even if you've done these things a million times before, I've been on so many field projects in my last 20 years of working in global emergency medicine. It still surprises me that things make me anxious or that I feel off balance. And so having people you can talk to is also super important. And last slide. So I think those would be the challenges and some of my lessons learned, and I hope that that's helpful for you. And I'd just like to thank Dr. Laurie Mazurek for this opportunity, and again, all of my colleagues on this panel, and I appreciate being part of this wonderful group of people. So I hope that's helpful, and have a good day.
Fernando, if you can share your screen and I'll introduce you. So Dr. Fernando Texera is an emergency medicine physician and global leader in the clinical aspects of diagnosis and management of coronavirus infection. He gained a lot of experience in SARS, which we in Toronto call SARS Senior, as COVID Senior, SARS 1 and 2 outbreaks in Toronto, and the subsequent COVID-19 pandemic. He is also focuses on the concepts of equity, inclusivity, and service to disadvantaged and disenfranchised members of society. After 17 years in St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, Canada, he moved to Fresno, California in 2019. We kept in contact as COVID surged in California, and sort of like what happened to Theresa, you could hear the change in the tone of his emails, which went from apprehension to grave concern, and finally resignation that here it is, and there's nothing much more to do other than to deal with it. Dr. Fernando Texera.
I just wanted to thank Lori for inviting me. As Lori says, we've been in contact almost every month since the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2. And she asked me to talk about my journey and our group's journey throughout this whole process. And I've given part of this talk before to my previous group at St. Michael's Hospital, and sort of in the brief email that followed, the question came, hey, if there was one message that you could give, what would it be? And it was basically a two-word answer. And it's a concept called adaptive resilience. And it comes from someone called C.S. Halling, or Buzz Halling, who was an ecologist back in the 70s. He graduated out of the University of Toronto, moved to BC, and ultimately became a preeminent ecology in the United States. And his contribution to this was this concept that the environment is always in a state of flux. And where we start this sort of infinity loop for all our Marvel fans out there is in the upper right-hand corner in what's called the rigidity trap. That's when homeostasis exists and we're all in a sort of calm state. With the onset of SARS and SARS-CoV-2, there was and continues to be a stress upon the system which causes a breakdown called the alpha, where we collapse and we release a whole bunch of our inhibitions, we release our energies, and we become resource rich, and we adapt and modify our processes in an active way to respond to any outside stress. If you follow the red line, it quickly becomes yellow. That's a period of reorganization where we attempt to better accommodate our systems to respond to any crisis. And then as we move to yellow to the blue zone, we have a period of growth where we become comfortable in our new system. And then we return back to K, which is our conservation, or what we consider the status quo. So again, the beginning for me was SARS back in 2003. We learned a lot of lessons. The most important lesson was you will never go back to where you were before. People who lived through SARS know that we had no Public Health Canada. That now exists. There was no infection control, infection prevention. Those systems all came out as a result of SARS. Well, here's the beginning, 2.0. December 31st, 2019, we had a very similar outbreak. So my talk is going to be about my personal journey and our group's journey through this, and how we used adaptive resilience to respond to what the virus was asking us to do. So at the very basis of what we do is we have a code orange. We have an external disaster. And for all the complexities that a code orange is, or an external disaster is, it's basically two very simple concepts. We have some extra work, and can you stay late and help out? Most of these concepts are designed for short-term hours, today's interventional situations with a very discrete endpoint. We know when it begins, we know when it ends. In a protracted code orange, which is what SARS in Toronto became, there was maybe a starting point, although it's very nebulous at the beginning, just like what we're experiencing now, and the endpoint is undetermined. So it is completely different than any existing disaster that we're trained to respond to. Well, how do we respond? Well, we begin with what we have as our existing disaster plan. And we look at it and say, okay, how are we going to use whatever key strategies we have to be our guiding principles about how we respond? it became quickly evident to me that what we were doing, what I was doing, was using this process of adaptive resilience. And for me, what were my most valuable resources, both renewable and non-renewable? And I put it to you in the group that people and time are our resources. And I'll come back to that at the very end. As you go through this closed loop system, you have to take strategic pauses and reflections at each step along the way. And you have to ask yourself and your group, what are we doing right? And more importantly, what are we doing wrong and what did we miss? It's not because we're not right or we're not wrong. We have to look at the virus because the virus is leading us down this pathway. And what are your deficiencies? This is very obvious. Knowledge is our deficiency in this whole pandemic, or local epidemic, as I call it. We don't know anything about this virus. We continue to learn about it every day, and it continues to challenge us every day. So once you wrap that all up, you then identify all the real and potential assets of your team. What do we have? What do we need? And what do we need to call out for? Well, really, what I want to talk about is the experience here in Fresno. I think it's very unique. So this is a picture of our residents. My program is a very resident-driven program and department where they take the lead and run departments with us supervising. So this is the University of California, San Francisco, Fresno perspective. And this was some data put together by Dr. Gil Ramirez, who's an informatics specialist and an emergency physician who I work with. And the gray bars represent the number of non-ICU hospitalizations, confirmed positive cases for all of San Francisco. And as you can see, in and around April, you see an uptick, and a very quick uptick in San Francisco in the number of COVID positive cases. If you look at the purple line, that's us in Fresno. We sort of had a delayed response, but when you look around mid-June, which is the x-axis, we see a gradual uptick in the number of cases. And then as July 1st hits, we are actually able to match the number of confirmed positive cases in Fresno in our single hospital. And that is exactly, almost to the T, the same number of patients that all of San Francisco and their 11 hospital system admitted. And our numbers stayed high. They remained high. There was a lull toward the end of the summer, and then the resurgence that everyone saw at the end of the year. And people might say, well, you know what, Tex, that's because you just see and admit just non-sick patients. Well, here's the ICU numbers. Again, gray bars, all of the 11 hospitals cumulative in San Francisco. The red line, our hospital standalone in Fresno. We were able to match the number of ICU admitted patients on a daily basis with 11 hospitals in San Francisco. And I point to the end of the year where we absolutely matched San Francisco. So this was an external disaster. It continues to be an external disaster. We had to adapt. We had to adapt quickly. We had to ask for help. We got some help. We didn't get enough help. And we quickly realized that we had to modify how we practiced medicine in an environment where we were very quickly overwhelmed. So that, in terms of patients, numbers, that's my perspective, and that's where we come from. So what did we decide? Well, we decided that there's a paradox. When you have an external disaster and it's protracted, what you have to do is you have to expand your footprint of your department to mitigate and externalize your exposure risk to the virus. And now I'm going to talk specifically about SARS-CoV-2. And the paradox is, as you expand your footprint, you're asking the health professionals that work with you and yourself to contract your scope and manner of practice. It's a very sort of instinctive thing, but you actually have to say it, realize it, and do it. And it's very difficult. And I think you heard Theresa from Italy talk about how she was literally walking around with a pulse oximeter and trying to decide who got treatment, who didn't. That is the extreme of a contracted scope of practice, but it's what you have to do. So as our department took a journey, I took a journey. Many of you have seen this before. I presented it. It's my mind map. It's my journey. So where do I sit? I sit in the ED department. That's that little rectangular square that unites the big hospital and the round loop that's in my community. And my scope of practice is extremely limited when it comes to SARS-CoV-2. My concepts are, I would like all my patients separated by 6 feet. I want everyone who can wear a mask wearing a mask. I want my colleagues to wear goggles, gloves, gowns, and masks if they can. And that falls under NPI or non-pharmacologic interventions. And I'm going to use a lot of oxygen, and I'm going to use a lot of dexamethasone. In the hospital, just off to the left, that's where my infectious disease colleagues, my ICU colleagues live. And that's where I think trials like solidarity trials come into play, where studies out of the Imperial College, which is, I'll talk towards the end of this talk, where I get my information. And this is where I think experimental regimes should be practiced in terms of therapeutics. So if you look up top, we plan. And now challenge 2, you execute your plan. How am I going to do all of that 6 feet NPI, administer oxygen, give steroids, as my little red bubble of SARS-CoV-2 sort of expands? And then I'm going to melt into a little bit of how do we adapt? How do we contract and expand? Well, here's a couple of sort of pictures. And this just, again, reiterates what I was talking about. Again, expand your footprint, contract your scope, practice donning and doffing, identify your risk and infected patients, maximize your PPE, maximize it. Don't minimize it, don't escalate it, because you have a lot more problems to talk about if you're talking about which mask to wear. Practice your protected code blue with assigned team members and identify your roles. So how do we operationalize that? Well, this is the entrance to our hospital emergency department. This is where all patients start if they're ambulatory. You come in, you register, you're given a mask, your temperature is taken, and you have your screens in terms of questionings of, where have you been? Have you had a fever? Have you had exposures? If you can walk and you're healthy, you then enter our tent system. Our tent system is 6 connected tents where you're triaged, you have blood work drawn, you have a medical note written, you can have x-ray done, and you can have some initial treatment processes such as nebulizers and oxygen administration. This is what it looks like on the inside. Again, what did we use as our guiding principles? We want to screen you. We want to keep you 6 feet away from us and everybody else, and we want you to wear a mask. So off to the left, that's our teleprompter. We do a virtual triage system. The second picture next to that is the big long hallway, just showing the separation. And then there at the bottom screen is what's called an oxygen concentrator. We, in late July, identified very quickly that oxygen was going to be the mainstay of treatment. We recognized that there was a potential, again, as our colleague from Italy stated, and we saw it in LA and in Brazil. If you don't have oxygen, your patients die. That's keeping it simple, but it's also keeping it very real. So we invested in oxygen concentrators, and we had 25 of them, and we used them all. We recognized that if we did this for ambulatory patients, we had to do it for EMS patients or people coming in by ambulance. So this is our green, what we call non-warm tent. These are for non-COVID or low-risk COVID patients. The ambulance pulls up and they're taken on a stretcher into that tent, triaged, set of vitals, blood work drawn. If you have a big system. We have connecting tents, and just off to where those red markers are, that's our warm tent. So that's where people with suspected COVID or COVID-like illnesses are triaged. So we separate all the patients and we keep them all separated throughout their process outside the hospital. Once they're in the hospital, they're separated into a COVID warm zone or the regular emergency department. We built the system so that we could expand and contract our warm zone to accommodate the number of COVID patients that we had at our peak. In the hospital, we had over 350 COVID positive or rule out patients. And at the peak of the ED, we had over 54 COVID positive admitted patients. And again, just another shot of the COVID warm tent. So that's how we conceptualized and operationalized the basic principles of non-pharmacologic interventions as we see it in the ED. I want to brush up on concepts in public health, because if I've got a map, I need guideposts. And what are my guideposts? How do I play chess with this virus? Because it's not a war. You're going to lose the war. This is a game, okay? The game is always led by the virus. We respond to whatever the virus challenges us with. And I want to talk about the reproductive rate, the positivity rate, prevalence, NPI, and eNPI. And so I'm putting back up the graph that I showed you about hospitalized patients. And if you look at the reproductive number, that is basically, for me, it's the inherent viral health. How healthy is the virus at reproducing? And what's the community response to non-pharmacologic interventions? The closer we get to 3, the worse we are and the better the virus is. How do we blunt the curve of patients coming into the department? Well, that's a product of enhanced or enforced non-pharmacologic interventions. We can do all we can say about stay-at-home lockdowns, but unless they're enforced, they have no action upon the reproductive rate. When you talk about positivity rate, for me, that's telling me how robust or how real the data is. If I have a positivity rate of 1%, I'm pretty confident that I'm capturing all the COVID positive patients that are out there. If my positivity rate is 30%, which is what it was in Fresno around December, I'm missing a lot of patients out in the community that have COVID. And the prevalence is really the disease burden. How sick is my community? So knowledge is power. I've used some guideposts. I've got this challenge with COVID. How do I learn about it? Well, I put to you that the traditional methods of reading textbooks and journals are fraught with danger and too slow. So I rapidly sort of found the website MedRxiv, BioRxiv, and viricologic.com. And the third one comes into play beginning of December, early January. And here's my rule. I go to the website every morning as I'm having my coffee, and I look at all the abstracts that have been published that day, which hover between 15 or 20. If you don't recognize more than 2 words in the title, skip it. Somebody else might be interested in that topic, but it's not for you. Recognize your signal to noise ratio. So you may see an article about 10 patients, but if you see the same conclusion being drawn in 3 or 4 countries about the same principle that you're reading about, that really should bring that idea or concept to the forefront. And I use that in lieu of power. I'm never going to do a power study, and I'm never going to read a published study on power during my response to SARS-CoV-2. And ask questions of the authors and of yourself, because many of the articles that have led to the new discoveries are literally, that can't be. Oh, it is. If you do choose to go to mainstream media, I would suggest CNBC or Bloomberg, because I'm telling you, the financial markets care more about what's happening with SARS-CoV-2 than traditional mainstream media. And then peer-reviewed journals last. So this is a great article. This came out in April of 2020.
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, I think it's coming into play. My concept is that this chess match should last about 4 years, and my goal is to play for a tie. So here's the map. The journey's ongoing. So I'd like to introduce the concept of surges and say, is it a surge or is it really a challenge? Think of that endless loop. We have another challenge. The first one was practicing and planning for the protracted code orange. The second one was operationalizing it, expanding capacity, restructuring your bed spacing, seeking out external resources. Your third challenge is really redefining and expanding your triage constraints, identifying local resource opportunities, and redefining healthcare roles, crisis standards. Standard of care, oxygen, dex, and supportive measures, convalescent plasma, azithro, remdesivir, monoclonals, minor, if no benefit. Vaccines, you know all about them. The slide, I put this up in mid-December, and I think we're seeing all the problems with it. You know, the scarcity of the resource, the just-in-time delivery, the last mile, getting it from the vial to the arm, very difficult. So check in one, we should have this wrapped up in 1 year. Sorry. Well, we have a variant. The variant arises from high prevalence with use of prolonged experimental regimes and increased transmissibility and disease burden. You saw it come out of England.
30 seconds.
And Brazil for a reason. So where am I living now? Well, looky here. SARS-CoV-2, people got admitted to hospital. They got prolonged treatment. When they were discharged, variants were born. The spin happened. We're starting to immunize on the little blue bubble there. We're very early in immunization. What does that mean? For me, vaccination may be the keystone to this, but public health is the cornerstone. It is the beginning, middle, and the end. Time is not a renewable resource, but that's why we're doing what we're doing. Staff are your most valuable resource. Don't minimize their importance and capitalize on their knowledge. And I just put up that adaptive resilience slide again, just to sort of emphasize that it's a closed loop and we continue to learn.
Thank you so much, Fernando. I'm sure we'll have questions for you in the QA. We're going to go to Evita Lewis now. So Evita, if you want to share your slides while I introduce you. Evita Lewis is a nurse who works in Canada's largest trauma center as an emergency nurse. We work at the same hospital in Sunnybrook. And she's also, like many of the of us that are sort of participating in this, works in remote Indigenous nursing stations, outposts in Northern Canada. She's currently working at Sena Memorial Nursing Station in Caribou Lake First Nation, also known as Round Lake or Wigamau Lake Indian Reserve, 87, an Oji-Cree First Nations community of roughly 1,000 people, approximately 320 kilometers north of Sioux Lookout, which is also in Northern Ontario. The challenges of these regions can be immense, and some residents have no running water, or the water may not be potable, and many burn wood for heat and hunt for food. Nursing stations can lose power, phones, and water all at once, and you quickly learn to adapt in order to survive. Most recently, as the nurse in charge, Evita worked closely with the community physician, the band council, the pandemic team, and the nursing manager to address the community's pandemic preparedness. Evita Lewis. So I'm not sure if you're on mute, Evita. Don't hear you. Yeah, you're on mute.
Hi.
There you go.
Thanks. Thanks. I'll start with a quick land acknowledgement. That, you know, those of us here in Canada today, we are on traditional land, and here in Toronto, we're recognized by Treaty 13. So we give thanks for the tribes whose lands we use and who've been here a long, long time before us. Like Lori said, I work at Sunnybrook as an emergency trauma nurse. Been doing that for the last 5 years, where I work in a very resource-rich environment and a very multidisciplinary team where all I really ever have to do is pick up a phone and call and ask for help if I need help. And on the other side of that, I work here at North Caribou Lake First Nation, which is a remote outpost community as a community health nurse. Like Lori said, about 320 kilometers away from Sioux Lookout. by air. So for some context, we are down here in Toronto, and this is the community that I work in, all the way up here, far enough away to be in a different time zone, as I learned when I started working up there. And I've just highlighted 3 of the other places that we work very closely with. So this is Thunder Bay, Sioux Lookout, and Winnipeg. And so this distance over here is about 320 kilometers by air. So the community itself, like Lori said, it's an Oji Cree First Nations community. There's about 1,000 people on community. But we are lucky to be one of the communities that does actually have all season road access. So we're not like most of the northern communities that just relies on the ice roads in the winter. So we are thankful to have that. And then these are some of the other spots in the community. And this is where I work. So this is Sena Memorial Nursing Station. And I have a quick little video here for those of us who might not actually know what a remote nursing station is. So,
what is a remote nursing station? On-reserve nursing stations are set up as primary health care for remote First Nations in Canadian provinces. The federal government is responsible for funding and administering health care to these remote communities. Nursing stations help provide such services where hospitals and other medical facilities don't exist. Teams vary in number depending on the size of the community they're serving. Nurses require additional training to work in remote regions with fewer resources and where conditions may be different from what they've encountered in other parts of the province. If a patient needs more care, they are flown to the closest hospital. During crisis situations such as a pandemic, nursing station teams are even more important. However, critics have raised questions about the quality of training and level of staffing at nursing stations. In 2021, Indigenous Services Canada runs 21 nursing stations on remote First Nations in Ontario.
So I work in a community of about 1,000 people, and I'm lucky if we're staffed with 4 to 5 nurses. The staffing, I guess, depends on the community size and the acuity. We aim for regular staff, but we're not always successful in that. Ideally, there's a nurse practitioner or a physician in the community physically at least 5 days a month. But again, that depends on the community size and acuity, with some of the bigger communities having physicians more regularly. And we do everything at nursing stations. There's really nothing that we don't do. If you think about anything that you would go to a family doctor for, an emergency department for, anything you would go to a public health clinic for, we do all of these things. This is what the nursing station up north that I work at looks like. So this is the emergency room over here. This is our lab where we send out most of our lab specimens, but we do have some access to point of care testing thanks to Orange. We have 5 of these clinic rooms down here. And this is our pharmacy where we dispense medications. So for anyone coming in with an acute illness who might require antibiotics or puffers because of an exacerbation or, an acute pain crisis, we would take care of all of those medications. So I put this slide in for some recognition of the existing challenges that exist in these communities. Like Lori said, it's hard to talk about COVID's impact without recognizing that these problems have existed in the north for a very, very long time. So there's a chronic healthcare shortage when you look at nursing and physician shortages. There's issues with building code problems at some nursing stations. There's issues with lack of training, depending on where you work. First Nations housing tends to be fairly overcrowded. Many of the houses are below normal standards. This article mentions that, a shortage of decent housing means as many as 26 people live in one unit. There's environmental concerns that we need to keep in mind as well. Some communities still have access or poor access to clean running water and clean drinking water. Mental health resources really, really struggle. And there's a lack of cultural safety. Sometimes there's a lack of cultural competence, and there's just systemic racism that still exists to this day. So in keeping all of those things in mind, being very new to the role, these are some of the ways that I've seen COVID affect my role and some of the considerations that I've had to think about that I would really never have to think about anywhere else. Especially if I was working in Southern Ontario, if I was working at a hospital, I would never really have to think about these things. But we've seen a change in our nursing station processes where, patients now get screened on arrival. So we have a front entrance for patients who screen negative and a back entrance for patients who screen positive. But some of the things that we've had to think about is a lot of these nursing stations that were built in the 80s and 90s, it's very old infrastructure. They don't have such things as negative pressure rooms. If you're in one of the communities that has poor access to clean water, how do you keep your nursing station clean in the middle of a pandemic? We've seen a change in services provided where there's a lower focus or a lower priority on wellness and preventative care. And I know other parts of Canada and Ontario have struggled with this as well, where a lot of, PABs, immunizations, things like that have been delayed. But the thing that I found hard was that if you're working in a community that's chronically underfunded or chronically underserved or short, can you afford to delay those things? Because who knows when they might pick back up. We've had a lot of increased training with airway management, oxygenation, respiratory conditions, with a lot of new equipment sent up and a lot of new training and things like that. The way that this has really affected our role is that we've really had to be on top of doing consistent and regular inventory of supplies and medications. Recognizing, that some of the nursing stations, you can count the number of oxygen tanks you have available. And if you're putting someone on high flow oxygen potentially, how long can you really sustain that person in your nursing station? This is something that we haven't had to do yet, thankfully, because things haven't been bad. But, going into a wave 3 in Ontario, we work very closely with Orange for our medical evacuation needs. As those priorities change, we will end up taking care of sicker patients in the nursing station and for longer periods of time without transferring them to a higher level of care potentially. And again, like I said, we work very closely with Orange. So, Orange has been really involved with transporting COVID patients all across Ontario. So as those provincial needs change, how does it work when we need to evacuate a patient from a nursing station? Will there even be hospital beds available, recognizing that we transfer patients out to Thunder Bay, Winnipeg, and Sioux Lookout? Will people have places to go? There's been a lot of new roles introduced to the nursing stations, like RPNs, PCPs, ACPs, kind of as a Band-Aid on the cracks in the healthcare system that have existed for a long time, but recognizing that comes with a lot of turnover and that every 4 weeks you have someone new coming into the community that you then have to train. There's been a lot of work with the actual community in getting community members involved to facilitate rapid testing, training, rollout. There's been a lot of work with the local pandemic teams to think about outbreak considerations, right? So, if you have one positive case in a multi-generational home of 20 or 25 people, and you're talking about socially distancing and physical distancing and isolation and things like that, if your clinic is 5 clinic rooms in an emergency room, where are you going to put people if there is an outbreak, right? So we've had to start thinking about potentially using the school gym as an outbreak site, but these are conversations that we've started to have. The biggest impact that I've really seen COVID have on the community is that it's definitely worsened people's mental health. So there's already very poor access to mental health resources. There's a lot of existing trauma in northern communities. And now you're adding this layer of social isolation, which has really worsened a lot of things. Fear is definitely the biggest thing that I've seen in the community. So there's a very real and valid recognition of the pre-existing vulnerabilities that exist in northern communities. So there's a real mistrust of the government, a real mistrust of the healthcare system because of unjust treatment that has existed for many years and still exists in some ways. So that causes a lot of fear. And I think a lot of people recognize that if COVID does make it to the north, people will die in these communities. There will be a real loss of culture, a real loss of the ways of knowing, and a real loss of tradition. there's a reluctance to seek healthcare because no one wants to come to the nursing stations anymore because they know the nurses will fly them out to these COVID hotspots like Thunder Bay and Winnipeg for investigations. So no one wants to come in anymore. And there's also the recognition that when these people return to community after their medical appointments, they have to isolate for 7 to 14 days, depending on where they're coming back from. And if you're living in a household of 10, 15 people, it's not just you isolating, it's everyone in that household isolating. These are some of the First Nations communities that have been hit by COVID-19. And it really just kind of solidifies why we're taking it so importantly, I guess, and why it's such a big deal. Because really, I do think that if it did make its way up north, it would really be devastating. But lastly, there's hope, right? It's not all doom and gloom, I hope. The community has been incredibly involved. Their response to getting things locked down under control has been massive. There have been local pandemic teams created. The community is incredibly involved with trying to keep community members engaged and recognizing that there's a lot of social isolation that has happened because of this. Even though we have an all-season road, our community has been locked down for the last year, so people are only allowed to travel out for medical purposes. But there's been, lots of really fun activities created. There is a curfew to try and curb some of the social gatherings that might happen, but the community has been incredibly engaged. And so, even a year later, we've had one case of COVID that was extracted out before anything could come of it. And it wasn't even a local case. It was someone who had traveled into community for work. And there's hope, right? So thanks to Orange, vaccines have made their way up north. And I think thus far the number is 8,000 Indigenous people on reserve have been vaccinated. So as more people get vaccinated, there is hope that things will be curbed and we will prevent some of the disasters that have happened in other places like Italy and California and China and things like that. So thanks for listening. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Avita. I really appreciate your honest and sort of frank description of what it's like there. There are certainly little pokes of outbreaks right now in different First Nations community. I think all of us share your and their concern about the impacts, even with immunization, that it can have on the community. So I'm just looking for a Q&A. We won't be able to run Kirsten's video, but we will send everybody a link because you can do that because we are running out of time. But Avita, this is a question for you. Is there apprehension regarding the vaccine amongst the northern communities? And I think, you would definitely be able to answer that. And I'll just mute my mic.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for the question. So there's been a lot of apprehension for sure. And I know, so we work very closely with the Sulaka First Nations Health Authority, which is kind of like our local public health organization that oversees like vaccine uptake and things like that and has been involved with that. There's a lot of apprehension, there's a lot of mistrust of the government, like I said. So, and there's a lot of mistrust of the medical system. So the vaccine has made its way up there, but there is a lot of fear. There's some of the comments that I've heard from Indigenous people at the reserve I work at are, they do feel like second-class citizens. And so they do think that, they're going to get the cheaper vaccine. They're going to get the ones that aren't as effective. The Canadian government also has a history, unfortunately, of testing medical procedures on Indigenous and First Nations people. So I think to this day, that memory still resonates with a lot of people and it promotes a lot of vaccine hesitancy. There's also a lot of myths, unfortunately, circulating on Facebook, which don't help. So how our community has kind of helped with that is that our community physician, Dr. Folk, he does a lot of radio shows. He does a lot of vaccine promotion. He gets, he does call-in sessions on the radio and things like that where people can call in, they can ask their questions and they can have their questions addressed and be heard to why, the vaccine is a good idea and why people should take the vaccine and how we can address some of that vaccine hesitancy. But there still is a lot of hesitancy in these communities.
Thanks, Evita. It looks like we've got 2 more questions here. Question for this is Noor, by the way, just moderating your Q&A for you guys. This is a question for Fernando. California was overwhelmed, much like Italy. How did you and your team react emotionally to the stress? What did you do to lift your spirits? Very heavy question, and I would love to hear from you, Fernando.
I think we were fortunate in that we very early on recognized that San Francisco and LA had a surge that we weren't having in April and May. And so we had time to prepare physically in terms of, as I said, the spacing of our hospital and how we were going to practice medicine. And when we started having the trickle in early May and June, we felt like we had prepared. By that time, we had Lori give us a talk on how to prepare a department. We had a talk from Isaac Bogosh on the virus. We had a talk by Eileen Davila about the public health measures that were going to be required. So in that sort of academic space, we felt like we had some idea. So the group contributed its resources given all that information. And so everyone felt like they were contributing from the very beginning. And I will say from the administrative point of view, every ask was given. If you wanted an N100, you got an N100. If you wanted N95s and a shield, you got it. And so the ramping up was something that was spectacular. Those tents went up in 3 days. I will say that at the end of December, when literally people were taken off the ambulance and put into body bags on my shift, and you were running from one room to another to pronounce patients, there were questions asked of our very sort of being of what we were doing, because there was no end in sight. And so I think if anyone who's lived through this can say that they will ever practice the same medicine and look at the same sort of processes without sort of rose-tinted glasses, I don't think they're true to themselves and true to the experience. And for me personally, I continue to project forward. So my planning right now is for the UK variant when it hits at the end of March. And we're looking at how we will adapt to that and how we're going to deal with what looks to be a younger population who will be sicker and probably sit in our hospitals for a longer period of time. And so that's how the group and I have responded, is we look forward and project. We don't look back. We don't wait for numbers. And I can't emphasize enough that MedRx IV, the answers are there. Don't just read stuff from your own country. Look around the world, because what's happening in Italy, South Africa, Brazil, it will come to you. It will come. There are no borders. The mistake we make are thinking that there are borders.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Quick question to Evita. Is there a gender face to any of these challenges as part of what I think just in general? And Greg, if you can get ready to share your screen, and I'll do your introduction shortly after Evita takes a crack at answering that.
Sorry, do you mind what does that question mean? Sorry.
I guess, are there any gender issues related to vaccine hesitancy or any kinds of access issues in the North, or is gender not a relevant sort of challenge in the north?
That's an interesting question, actually. I don't really know how to respond to that. I personally haven't encountered any issues, nor have I ever heard of anyone ever saying that their gender has been an issue with the work that they do or providing healthcare or anything like that. So no, I'm not really sure how to comment on that. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, maybe that's a good thing. So,
yeah.
Okay, so Greg, if you could, Greg Chiatone, if you could share your screen, and we're going to go on to session 2. Have you shared your screen? Okay, there we go. Okay, and
yes, can you see it?
Yep, I've got it. So I'll just introduce Greg, and then Greg is going to introduce the rest of the guests in session 2 while I moderate or watch for questions. And people online, please put your questions in the chat box or the Q&A so we can bring them forward. As for Kirsten's video, we didn't want to risk the challenge of not having it work again. So we will share the link with you afterwards. It's an amazing video, and I think there's a lot to be learned there. But Greg is Dr. Chiatone, and by the way, Greg, Theresa from Italy told me how to say your name correctly, because I wouldn't have, is an emergency physician and president of the World Association for Disaster and Emergency Medicine. He's the director of the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center Fellowship in Disaster Medicine, an associate professor of emergency medicine at Harvard Medical School, and an instructor for the Department of Health Policy and Management at Harvard, T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Chiatone, I think this goes on forever. He's an incredibly accomplished guy, but he's also the director of medical preparedness for National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, a joint program with HSPHS and Harvard Kennedy School of the Government. Dr. Chiatone has been serving as a consultant to the White House Medical Unit for over 10 years. We could probably have a webinar just on that in the last 4 years experience. His clinical and field experience includes 25 years practicing as an emergency physician and over 500 missions as a flight physician on aeromedical helicopter services. He has conducted education programs in more than 30 countries around the world, written over 150 scholarly works, and is working on the second editions of Chiatone's Disaster Medicine, a textbook. And he's the recipient of the American College of Emergency Physicians Disaster Medical Services Awards and the 2020 recipient of the American Academy of Disaster Medicine Distinguished Service Award. So he will take us through the impact of crisis and disaster on the standards of care. Dr. Greg Chiatone.
Thanks, Lori. I do appreciate that that correct pronunciation. So we've heard some really terrific talks, and we'll continue to hear terrific talks. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take more of an overarching 30,000-foot kind of view on things, where we are now with COVID, and perhaps take a look into the future a little bit. I know we're going to talk about crisis standards of care. I'll touch on that, but I'm going to get into a little bit more of this idea of the COVID experience that we're having. So, the question is this a generational event? Honestly, not really. Not really, as I'll show you in a moment. But, 1918, the pictures depicted here, was a time when we didn't have vaccines. We really couldn't and didn't have therapeutics. So those non-pharmaceutical interventions are really important. As you can see, mask wearing is nothing new. 1918, over 100 years ago, picture on the right, you can see people wearing masks because they knew that would cut down on this spread. So, if you look at things, again, where we are now, there's been a number of pandemics in the last 100 years and in more recent times. I mean, we've had experience, of course, with coronavirus, recently with SARS and MERS, and that was touched on a little bit in one of the talks. We didn't really ever have to create a vaccine or really have effective therapeutics with that because, quite honestly, it sort of petered out on its own. Sorry, 1 second here. So now where are we? We're at this 2.5 million-ish deaths around the world. In historical perspective for pandemics that have caused that degree of global death rate, we've seen influenza really do that, 1918, 1958, 1960, and 69. But if you look at their R0 values, which is a measure of essentially how contagious they are, they all hovered around between 1 and 2. If you look at coronavirus, however, It's dramatically more than that on this scale. So that's a concern. And of course, we have new more contagious variants coming about. But again, this is nothing new. And one thing that you'll hear me say a couple of times during this short presentation, because I'm going to be brief, is that we need to do it better next time. Because we've had enough chances now to get it right, and I'm not sure how many more chances we'll have in the future to get it right. So crisis standards of care, this was first put forth in the United States here in 2009, 2010 from the Institute of Medicine. It's this idea of how do you change the standards that you practice based on providing the most good for the most people in a crisis. This can be as small as a disaster triage, let's say a mass casualty incident, where you have, at least on a short term, more needs than you have assets, and you have to do some disaster triaging based on that. We dabble with this here in the United States whenever you open up a field hospital and you're caring for patients who should be inpatient hospital patients in a convention center and a field hospital, you're somewhat modifying the standard of care to, again, accommodate the public health need. Two things that face us, and will continue to face us, because this is really the first large-scale testing of this idea of crisis standards of care, is when to trigger and how to scale them down, how to downregulate them. And this will be an ongoing thing. I think the after-action analysis of this event, this COVID pandemic, will be long and very detailed. And this will be one of the things that we look at. But let's take a look forward a little bit by looking backwards and looking and seeing where we are now. This pandemic experience has really been a tale of two or more worlds. So the graph on the left, shows the cumulative death rates in different countries. Don't worry about the color graphs. And you can see many countries, had that initial surge, but then because it's cumulative, it's not ever going to go down. So it just kind of leveled off. But as you can see, a number of countries did not. They never really got to that leveling off and just continued on the curve up. Here in the United States, quite honestly, we did worse than anywhere else. I've got a whole nother lecture to talk about that. But look at how dramatic the fatality rate essentially is between, say, us, the United States, and other countries that are not small. Like Japan, let's say South Korea, and some others. It's dramatic, and it's something we really need to analyze greatly after this. Non-pharmaceutical interventions, mask wearing, you saw it in 1918. Listen, there's no mystery here, okay? The moment, at least here and perhaps other places, the moment that we turned a proven public health measure into a political, allegiance or politicized it at all is really where we lost the game. And that's just unfortunate, something that we have to change. So we have to understand that we're in like a fish tank, right? What happens in your fish tank when a fish gets sick? Well, they all get sick. So we're here on this planet. We're not just humans. There's animals. There's this idea of one health, the crossover between animals and humans. And we need to do better at this global coordination in the world of disaster medicine, particularly in something like this that can so quickly go across the globe and cause the problems that we did. We need to work together with that unity of mission so that we can make sure that we don't get these outbreaks going to then epidemics and pandemics. How do you fix these going forward? I mean, how do you prevent a pandemic? It's simple. This is not rocket science, right? Early detection, there's something new, I think, maybe something different, I'm not sure. Containment, early containment, and then figure it out. Okay, I think there's something new. We're going to contain it. We're going to figure out if it is new or not. If it's not, fine. We don't have to contain it. It's just one of the diseases we deal with. If it's new, a novel coronavirus, a novel virus in general, well, at least we've contained it or did our best chance at containing it. And if it is something new, then we alert everyone else until we can bridge ourselves to vaccinations or vaccines and effective therapeutics. We have the non-pharmaceutical interventions. That's really what this is all based on. So we have to look at different things. And quite honestly, we've done some things well. We've had issues with PPE, for instance, supply chain issues. We've had issues with testing and testing equipment supply chains, but we can come up with solutions to that. Not getting into a lot of detail, pool testing with low disease prevalence is actually a great way to save testing capability when you might be somewhat low on that. The idea is that you take, say, 20 people, you swab them all, you test one, and you mix them, you test one. If it's positive, then you have to go back and test everybody. But if it's negative, you can go on and say they're all negative. That works well in low disease prevalence areas. The idea of wastewater surveillance, we found actually we can test wastewater and detect the virus a couple days before symptoms or other things. This is being used in some universities, dormitories, having wastewater testing done. And then, if it's positive, kind of like pool testing, you go and you test everybody, and maybe you pick out the person who's positive before they can be very, contagious or before they get symptomatic, let's say. So where are we now here? So we're in this idea of, 2021, we have the vaccines, we're starting to ramp it up. There's all that emergency management involved with ramping it up. But also, how do you balance the non-pharmaceutical interventions with the vaccine ramp up? We don't know. If you go to the CDC website, you'll see some issues addressed. Some information addressing this, but it's more this idea of, most frequently asked questions. It's a little bit of a mystery. So it's this whole idea of we're up here with the non-pharmaceutical interventions, we're down here with the vaccine. As we start getting more and more vaccinated and get to that vaccine-mediated herd immunity, how do we start scaling this down? And where does it all end up in the end? Not sure. We're gonna build this sailboat as we go. These are somewhat uncharted waters, but the general overall thought is we need to keep up our non-pharmaceutical interventions, social distancing and mask wearing through at least a significant period of the vaccination process. The gorilla in the room, it's the economy. If this was strictly a healthcare crisis, it would be simple. You take everybody, you put them in a box for 2 or 3 weeks, the disease goes away, right? Obviously, for many reasons, we can't do that. Excuse me. Because the economy will be decimated. And we've decimated economies around the world. So it's that, again, that idea of dueling disasters where you have the healthcare disaster, the economic disaster, and we got to address them both. So the future, what do we need to do? This idea of global participation, this idea of, it's okay to have geographical boundaries and different country, sovereign country boundaries, et cetera. But when we start talking about a global healthcare issue, we need to have a better way of crossing these boundaries and effectively working as a fish tank, let's say, on trying to stop these things before they start. Borders have become porous transportation-wise, which means the virus can get from one side of the planet to the other in a matter of 10 or 11 hours. We need to equally be able to work so that we can contain these things. And remember the nightmare scenario. I'm going to kind of wrap up with this. As I said before, we have had some opportunities to get this right. You've seen the last 100 years, a handful of or more of these epidemics and pandemics. We really need to get it right. This really is all about community-based public health in a crisis. I, as a doctor, treat a patient in the emergency department, let's say, and that's a very typical patient, doctor or nurse patient interaction, a one-on-one kind of thing. This is not that. This is community-based public health. This is the community helping itself, saving itself through using things like non-pharmaceutical interventions and other techniques. How do we do that? Well, we do a better job at community education. We do a better job at the policymaking level by taking the information and the data from our subject matter experts, our scientists, our economists, et cetera, assimilating that and coming out with good policy. We make that policy understandable. We make that policy and the information truthful. We have the community and the public believe in us so that they will then take the steps necessary. One of the countries that did really, really very, very well early on, especially in the pandemic, was the Czech Republic. and one way or one reason they did that was they very effectively promoted this idea of mask wearing to the public. And I think still you can Google it today. If you Google, Czech Republic and mask, you'll see this really well done professional video put out by the Czech government, really encouraging and showing people the importance of mask wearing early on. And if you look at their curve early on, they never really hit that huge spike. They were very flat for a long time. So this is community-based public health and the nightmare scenario, okay? So you've seen the R0 and how contagious COVID is. Let's imagine for a moment a novel virus emerges that has the R0 value, let's say, of measles or mumps, 10 times or more contagious than COVID-19. And then let's say it has a low dispersion factor, which means it's easily dispersed through activities like singing, yelling, et cetera, these things that disperse viruses more. and let's say it has a case fatality rate, not of COVID, which depending on what part of the world you live in is somewhere between 1 point something and even up to as high as 6%, but has a case fatality rate of, say, Ebola, which is 50 to 70%, or even rabies, which approximates 100% case fatality rate. I would suggest to you that that virus, if we don't do it right, if we don't learn the lessons that we need to learn, would not only decimate our healthcare systems, would not only decimate our economies, would actually threaten us as a species. And that's a scary thing to talk about. But, there is hope, as we said, and we will learn from these things. We always do to a certain extent. And we need to, I think this really was a wake-up call. Is it a generational event? No, they've come many times in the last 100 years. They will continue to come. It's how we treat them and how we deal with them that's going to determine the outcomes. So what do we need to do, kind of looking into the future? Risk assessments. All the next 6 months are going to be just many different, at different levels, risk assessments of disease prevalence based on numbers of vaccinated and are we getting to that vaccine-mediated herd immunity yet or not? We need to keep up the NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions. If we don't do the screening and the testing and the contact tracing, we're going to be flying blind. So that's going to be very important things to do as well. We need, in my opinion, more emergency management in our leadership. I mean, there's a role for everybody. There's a role for the public health expert. There's a role for the infectious disease expert, obviously the emergency physician, the critical care physician, et cetera. But we need to have something that merges emergency management into this, especially now when we're talking about vaccine rollout. That's all logistics. And that's really emergency management. And one area that marries those two things together, crisis, healthcare, and emergency management, is disaster medicine. So getting more disaster medicine specialists involved in this, I think, will be important. Contingency planning. I like to say when I teach my fellows and others around in various talks I give, it's good that you have a disaster plan. Love to see that the hospital has a disaster plan, but better the planning than the plan. Okay, because, as Mike Tyson said, I think all good plans, all plans last up until you get punched in the face. Every disaster will inevitably take a left-hand turn and right-hand turn. And the longer the disaster lasts, like COVID, the more left-hand turns and right-hand turns it's going to take. So your disaster plan, which is a very linear thing, will get you through probably the very, short first 5-10% of the crisis, but then you're going to be able to and need to be able to pivot. And that's all about the planning process. We fight like we train and we train like we fight is something the military says. Well, you need to fight this virus, fight these disasters, this pandemic, with the same people in the same way that you train for them. It's that leadership group, whether it's your hospital, your healthcare system, whatever it is, that's going to work its way through this. And the more experience you have working together and coming up with these contingencies, the better. And we all will eventually bridge to vaccine-mediated immunity. So I will leave it at that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And really have the privilege and honor of introducing the other presenters that are coming up in the second phase. Laura, if I can ask you to share your screen while I give your bio. So Laura Archer is a senior officer, medical services and emergencies at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. She has over 15 years of emergency humanitarian experience, having worked across the globe in conflict zones, natural disasters, epidemics, and in complex humanitarian emergencies. She's currently based in Geneva. Laura, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. And you can see my screen, I hope. Thank you so
Yes.
much for having me. Thanks, Lori. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for the introduction. So yes, I work with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And I will talk, we'll switch gears a little bit. I'd like to talk about emergency response teams, often deployed in humanitarian settings and often deployed across borders. But we'll also touch on domestic response and some of the challenges and things we've learned through the COVID pandemic thus far. So I will go to the next slide. Okay, so what I would like to talk about, and I will try to be nice and brief, just very briefly, I'll talk about IFRC and what we do. I'll talk about our response teams and how we deploy. And then I think more importantly, we'll get into minimum standards and assuring high quality care. How do we do that in disaster settings, including emergencies, pandemics, situations where resources are overwhelmed? How do we assure quality? And then I'd like to talk about working with local counterparts, which I think will link to following speakers talking about integrating communities into response, and then discussion, although we will save questions to the end, so we won't get into that right now. So IFRC, I think most people in the room know something about Red Cross or Red Crescent. So I won't go into it other than to say, basically, we're the world's largest humanitarian network. We consist of 102 Red Cross or Red Crescent national societies. So when I say national society, that is a Red Cross or Red Crescent of a country. I use a lot of acronyms, so I'll try to be good with that today. Around the globe, we currently have over 14 million active volunteers connected within the larger network through the national societies. And we work before, during, and after emergencies, really focusing on humanitarian values, emergency response, and providing safe healthcare. So the role of the Federation, I'm kind of one step removed insofar as it's really our national societies that are boots on the ground and are responding to the pandemic. So for example, I know many of you are in Canada. The Canadian Red Cross is doing tons of work responding to COVID. And every national society within the Red Cross, Red Crescent network is mandated to be auxiliary to their government. So that's what makes us a little different from some NGOs or other international responders, where in 192 countries, we have already a national society operating on the ground, doing long-term programming. And the scope of activities can range everything from swimming lessons to hospital care and everything in between. So where I work a lot is with what we call our ERUs, emergency response units. And these are field clinics and field hospitals that deploy during disasters across international borders. So in large-scale disasters, these teams are deployed to assist the national society that's already on the ground to respond and basically to gap fill while the national society who is working with the Ministry of Health gets their feedback on the ground. So these emergency response teams, I mean, they were originally designed with sudden onset disasters in mind. So you think big earthquakes, big hurricanes, and very acute and short term. But what we're learning with COVID, as well as with the changing nature of humanitarian world, with all the protracted long-term crises, is that there's a need for these teams to operate outside of this sudden onset situation. And so, you know, before COVID, during the pandemic, and after as well, we've really started to put a lot of work into how can we adapt our teams to respond not only in sudden onset disasters, but in other emergencies, as well as how can we make these teams more modular, more tailor-made, and always integrating the local national society into the response. So the basic principle, you know, we always want, and I'm sure you've all heard this, you know, we want response to be as local as possible and as global as necessary. So in a dream scenario, every single Red Cross, Red Crescent, and their Ministry of Health would have all the resources and all the human resources, the stuff, the space, the systems, all of it to respond to disasters. However, we know that's not always the case. And so if the local resources are overwhelmed, that's when we look at providing regional support. So we've offices and people and teams working in the regions who can provide surge support to the national society in small or medium disasters where it might just be some technical support, an influx of supplies, PPE, that kind of thing. And then when we get into the large scale disasters, that's when we step up and use what we call our global surge tools. So these global surge tools are what I'm talking about when I talk about these emergency response units. What's been really interesting about the COVID-19 pandemic is we really see it as a global domestic response. So every single national society, every single Red Cross, Red Crescent in the world is somehow involved in COVID-19 response. And when we look at our traditional ways of responding and the resources on standby and the ability to go from local to regional to global, that's been really challenged in a lot of ways because everybody's busy in their own domestic response. So the actors, the national societies that traditionally have people and teams and are ready to deploy to support sister or brother national societies, they're not available. And it's because they are working in their own hospitals or because travel restrictions don't allow it. So it's been a very, I think, amazing year learning how we can really focus on that local response and how we can support local response in innovative ways and reduce this global footprint and the need for global resources to be flown in and really support the local actors. One thing I wanted to mention is how we deploy. So our teams always deploy upon request of the local national society, or what we often call the host national society. So when there's a large scale or medium scale disaster in a country, the first step, of course, is the local national authorities with the Ministry of Health doing the immediate response. If their assessment tells them that they want and are requesting international support, then and only then do we deploy our teams. And it's always to, when we do deploy the teams, it's always to arrive on the ground and work hand in hand with the national society. We would never deploy these teams just unilaterally and set up services because we know that that doesn't work. And that would just be against all of our mandate and how we work and how we want to support each other. I'll go very briefly. We have different types of response units. One is the Red Cross Emergency Hospital, which is large surgical capacity, most often deployed in a sudden onset earthquake disaster where there are acute trauma needs, high surgical needs in a very short amount of time. And then oftentimes the system is able to recuperate. And after 2-3 months, the hospital can tear down and stop operations. What I want to mention, there's the hospital as well as the clinic. So the clinic is basically a smaller version. It's all the stuff, systems, people, space that you need to provide acute surge response to a struggling health system. Fully self-sustainable. So these teams bring all their own food, water, accommodation, everything. What's a little different about our teams compared to some other teams is that because we are privileged to have this network and work closely with the local Red Cross or Red Crescent, when there is no longer a need for the team and the team packs up and can go home, we donate all of the assets and all of the learning to the local national society. And the reason is, as I said at the beginning, ideally, the next time there's an emergency, the local capacity has grown and benefited from the current disaster and can then use the assets and the learning to respond independently and to not request that local or that global surge. So when we talk about these emergency medical teams, we call them ERUs, how do we assure that we're providing the best possible high quality medical care? How do we ensure that we're doing no harm? How do we gauge this? How do we plan for this? How do we prepare? It's absolutely critical. And I think that the humanitarian world really woke up after the Haiti earthquake in 2010 and got together and said, right, even in a mega disaster, there needs to be some sort of minimum standard. It is not, some things are just not okay ever. People need to be treated with dignity. People need pain medicine, pain management when they're having surgical procedures. Patients need their dignity. They need to be treated with humanity. We need to make sure that people we're sending in acute emergencies are the right people with the cultural competencies and have the right training and skills. And there is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the EMT initiative, which is an initiative of WHO that has published what's called the Blue Book. And it really outlines minimum standards specifically for teams deploying in emergencies. Now, the first version of this was way back in 2011. Everything's being revised and expanded, and we're starting to look at these emergency teams in pandemic situations, highly infectious teams. But this initiative and this Blue Book is a really fantastic way and a fantastic, I think, example of the global humanitarian community coming together to have consensus on what is the minimum. And we should all try to exceed that, but this is the red line. So we adhere to those standards and have been part of that process all along and continue to be, because we feel very strongly that it's not only what you do, it's also how you do it and how you treat the people that you're serving. So of course, all of the quantitative stuff matters, lives saved, it all matters, but it needs to be done well. And this thinking that you can do something clinically in a disaster that you would never do at home, or you can work outside of your scope of practice because it's an emergency and you're in a foreign country, completely unacceptable. So that kind of brings me to how we choose our teams and looking at competency-based selection. So making sure when we're sending teams out, we have the right people with the right skills. Obviously, clinical skills matter, and you want to make sure, for example, if you're sending an obstetrician gynecologist, that person, in fact, has recent clinical practice as an obstetrician gynecologist and hasn't been working in a fertility clinic for 20 years, just as an example. So it's the clinical competency, it's also the cultural competencies and the ability to work in high stress environments and the ability to do so in a collaborative, multidisciplinary, multicultural team. And we find this,
2 minutes.
Thank you. And this can be a tricky piece. And I think that this is one of the most important things, both for domestic response as well as international response, to really make sure, number one, for the patients and the people we serve, and number two, for the team members themselves, to make sure that we're not putting people in a situation where on one hand, someone may receive care that is not humane or not evidence-based, and on the other side, making sure we're not putting clinicians in a situation where they feel obliged to work outside their scope and outside their area of expertise. Working with local counterparts. So as I mentioned, when our teams deploy, they integrate with local staff, and I think this is the most critical component of any disaster and emergency response, is integrating throughout all levels of the organization and the response to your local counterparts. With COVID-19, it could not be more clear. And looking at, it is the community and the volunteers in the community that are going to provide those non-pharmaceutical public health measures. It is the volunteers in the community that are going to assist with screening, contact tracing, quarantine, isolation, and then as you go up more and more, hopefully into ambulance and assisting with other services and social services. Obviously, the benefits, we could have a whole session talking about the benefits of communities working in their own communities, cultural understanding, the language, understanding religious aspects that may be particular to that region, understanding the resources that are available, providing those links. How do you deal and support unaccompanied minors or survivors of sexual or gender-based violence? All of these things. It is my opinion that you can't expect, and you shouldn't do this as the team coming in, but rather as the global team working together on the ground. So I will stop because I know we have more speakers. I think I could go on forever about this topic, but I will stop here and look forward to the discussion at the end. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Laura. That was terrific. I think we share another friend too, Ian Norton, who I know worked closely with the EMT in WHO. But thank you so much for all your hard work and the great things that you've done around the world. Okay, so we're going to move to the next presentation. If I can ask Ellen Bull to please share your screen, and I will introduce you. So Ellen Bull is the academic chair of Nursing Collaborative, Bridging to University Nursing and Postgraduate Programs and Paramedics at Centennial College in Toronto. She has more than 40 years of experience in healthcare and education. She spent her first decade of her nursing career in critical care and was director of emergency and critical care nursing at Scarborough General Hospital in Toronto, Canada. She moved to clinical education, has become an academic nursing administrative leader. Her passion is the integration of emergency preparedness, simulation, and interprofessional education into community and health programs. Ellen has been academic lead for over 15 large-scale interprofessional mock disaster simulations and research studies. Ellen, it's a pleasure to hear your talk. Ellen, you're on mute if you're speaking. Great. We can see your screen.
And view.
Ellen, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We can. Thank you.
Great.
And if you're able to turn your video on, please do.
It's not responding for some reason. The host has stopped it. It said, you need to let me share my video.
No worries, Ellen, just carry on.
I will. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ellen, and I'd like to first thank Evita for the land acknowledgement. We, Centennial College, is also from Toronto, and we would like to acknowledge the have the land acknowledgement at the beginning. What I wanted to say about Centennial is that we are a large community college, and with over 100 ethno-cultural groups. I'm the chair of the nursing program and the paramedic program. The nursing program has two partners, Ryerson University and George Brown College, and our degree paramedic program is partners with University of Toronto, Scarborough. What Lori asked me to talk about is the use of student teams. It's a passion for both of us. I'm actually going to be the advocate for students as a resource in the community that we need to be really looking at and how we can better utilize this resource. Centennial is known in terms of two main volunteer activities. The first one is the mock disaster, which Dr. Mazurek is the medical lead and I'm the academic lead. And this is for pre-licensure interprofessional education, and the students actually practice their skills in simulation. The other activity that Centennial is known for is the Global Citizenship and Equity Learning, which we shortly call GCELS. This is when we have student and staff teams that are deployed domestically and internationally for projects and to develop their leadership skills. Let's move. Oops, back one. The mock disasters, Lori and I have done, we have done over 15 at least, but when I started to look at the numbers, what I do have is that we have grown in student volunteer population, but also in reputation. So in 2009, we had 250 students from 5 different groups, and yet in 2019, which was our last mock disaster we did, we had over 407 students alone. That doesn't count the professionals and the faculty that participate in this mock disaster. And the whole idea is to develop teams, to develop our skills and work together. The key to success in looking at our teams and the development is, number one, is the scholarship and evaluation. So for every event that we have had from the beginning, we have always linked it with some kind of research in terms of satisfaction, in terms of learning, but also in terms of evaluations. Every time we're looking at what lessons are learned and what can we do better. The fundamental elements of those teams that we seem to develop which are key, is the professional role models. So we are working with the professionals in the GTA. We are looking at our preceptorships. We have great faculty commitment, so that is really important to us. And Nope, I'm still not able to, okay. And the other thing is that over the 10 years, we've looked at how do we actually make the learning valuable as curriculum for the students. So depending on the group of the students, whether, for example, pharmacy tech, they have their mock disaster as part of an assignment. The other groups use it as part of clinical for clinical hours, and some groups just use it as volunteer for leadership. What's really key to the success and the amount of volunteers that come forward, we have to turn away volunteers every year, is the fact that it's a fun and safe learning space. And that has been key right from the beginning. But is it going to jump again? I'm having trouble moving it forward, so hold on. There we go. What we have learned are a couple of things, and this has come from our evaluations and the research. Number one is that the students and the professionals want to volunteer. It's an intrinsic motivation. They want to help, but not only that, for many of them, and we teach the students how to gain control of their environment. So when we're looking at something like COVID, for example, these kind of teams actually give the students the ability to feel like they're doing something and controlling an external environment. But what's also a major lesson learned, and what makes them successful, is the fact that before we do anything, we identify the clear learning outcome for each group and each stage. So so each group has a learning outcome, such as pharmacy tech. It might be just making the particular meds, it might be distribution, but the overall development is working with interprofessional teams. We're also focused on the level of learning and the scope of practice. So as we focus on this, it allows us to help teach the professionals about the different scope of practice and abilities of the different groups, as well as the students learning this. I am going to start my video. There we go. Hi, everyone. And the last thing that we've really learned is that it's really important to make the scenarios fit the student learning. Come on. One of the questions that's always asked is, well, how do you select criteria for students and for the volunteers? And, once you've decided what the scenarios are or what the objectives of that your team's going to be doing, then it's quite easy because you've got the learning objectives. And now we then look at what are the students' skills and abilities. It's really interesting that now what we're learning is that there is such a cross scope between the different professions and the student groups that we can actually start to build the interprofessional teams. What the second thing that really matters for us is criteria for safety. So if we're going to be sending a team out, for example, domestically or in a project, then we really want to then look at the preceptors, the leaders, and the faculty available. The nice thing about our mock disasters is we have time to plan all this, and Dr. Mazurek has been very helpful in making sure that we've got really good preceptors and medical leaders coming in to be great role models for our students. If though we have to have a speed of decision in terms of we want to send a group out in a particular area, what really makes a difference is then looking at previous volunteer experience. What is it that the students already have? Do they already have their vaccinations? Do they already have CPR, first aid? In Ontario, if we want to send any kind of community volunteers, one of the things that is required is a vulnerable sector police check. Our health studies students all have to have this for clinical. And so when you look at clinical students, then they meet these requirements very quickly, and we already know all of these are done. The last thing, or not the last, and certainly not the least important, I'd say one of the most important things is the cultural prep or the education for the team. So we prepare the students for the mock disasters, what to expect. But also if we're sending a group, I took a clinical group to Roatan for a clinic. We had 2 weeks of cultural preparation and education about teamwork, about what to expect, and that's really important. And then the last thing that we talk about is cost, and that has been, Centennial has been very generous in supporting what we are wanting to do. My point in advocating for clinical students is that the clinical requirements for placements make health studies students very like rough diamonds for volunteers and for volunteer teams. So we need to be looking at what they can be doing more and more. What are the systemic challenges of using students, and why haven't we used students as much as we can? Luckily, I'm old, so I have been through SARS and H1N1. But one of the things we've learned is that there are competing objectives between the external and the internal groups. So we need to look at, we want to keep the hospital safe, we want to have learning environments, but how do we look at that and make the best of both worlds? Insurance and liability has always been an issue. We can now say that, over the years, it is not a big issue in Ontario because all of the colleges now have one provider. And so it makes us much easier to negotiate what students and where students can go in terms of liability. Obviously, for example, when COVID hit, the first thing that was an issue was PPE. And so the colleges and universities have supplies of PPE for labs and that, and we donated those and distributed those in the community. So our stores started to dwindle quite quickly, and that was absolutely the right move. What we do want to look at is, in terms of using the student teams, is the ministry and government support, and having the decisions of where students go and where they're useful. It should be at the ground level, rather than the senior executives of a hospital saying, "Oh, it's COVID, let's stop all students from coming." We have learned some things with history. One of the things that we learned with SARS, and that came about from SARS, is the agreement that last year our graduating students, so their final year graduating students, they are not pulled from clinical. They need the experience to be working in the areas and be ready to graduate and work. So that came from SARS. What came from H1N1 was the focus on PPE and infection control, so that all of the curriculums changed to include that right at the first semester as a priority, so that students could be ready and more prepared for clinical and for using it. I think what's interesting is that many of our partners aren't aware of that, but it's a safety thing for us, and it helps us move forward. It will be interesting to see what kinds of things we are learning from COVID, and then to use that as we move forward. We need to stress the valuing of student contributions, and certainly the valuing of them working with our interprofessionals. What's happened in Toronto with, and I'm going to talk about the GTA in terms of students with clinical settings and using clinical teams. Initially, the students were pulled except for the year 4. That was a safety thing, fully understandable, and it was a senior management decision. The issue is the impact it's going to have on our graduating students and the experiences they're going to have in the next coming years, because it's delaying the amount of clinical. So we certainly have lots of virtual clinical, but it's not quite the same. What has happened is the Registered Nurses of Ontario, Associated for Ontario, the heads of health studies have advocated for the students to return. And we can proudly say that right now, all of the students in all of the health studies have returned to their placements as of January 2021. That's a big event for us, because now we can relieve the students and teach the students about how to work in real life situations. And that will be new recommendations in terms of student participations are being developed. So what happened then during that last year? We worked in the in the community, but mostly what has happened is students stood by, and students were losing their jobs. So they became interested and they helped build food banks for other students. The paramedic group started COVID Companions. So COVID Companions is a community challenge, community support group. They've been matched with community members who are on their own, and they phone them regularly to double check on them, and they would do grocery shopping for them. The students are now being booked in vaccination clinics in both Women's College down at the Tazen, the downtown group of hospitals, as well as out in Scarborough. What's interesting now is that as we have moved, as we've described, as we have moved in from as in managing COVID, the demand for students, the demand for volunteers is getting higher than we can actually manage. That's a good thing. But I think what we are now learning is that, yes, we probably could have had those students in some places, in non-acute places, to help relieve the healthcare workers that were being so stressed over the years. Initially, when I did this PowerPoint, I said some students continue to not have placements. Not true. All of the students in all of our partner groups and in Centennial now have placements. So that's a positive thing. They're prepared for working with our interprofessional teams, and that's going forward. So this is some of the pictures of how we've prepared, and these are some of the mock disaster pictures that I just wanted to share with you. I also wanted to share that there is in the Journal of Interprofessional Education Journal, there in January of 2021, there's an article from that's based on our 2019 mock disaster. So I'm happy for questions. I'm an advocate for students. We need to make sure that they're safe and that they're not a burden, but boy, do they have some, we have some great resources that we're not using yet, and we need to think as a group and as part of lessons learned to use them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. That was terrific. It's been a real struggle, especially this COVID year. Placing students, whether it's medical students or any students, in this really difficult and dynamic environment. It looks like you've done a really great job at that. So thank you so much for the presentation. If I could ask Homer Teen, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, to please share your screen while I give you an introduction. So Homer Teen is the CEO of Orange, Ontario's air ambulance and critical care transport provider. Orange is currently leading Operation Remote Immunity, which is responsible for providing COVID-19 vaccinations for all remote, air-accessible Indigenous communities in Ontario. 3 of Ontario's medical schools are contributing staff and trainees to the vaccination team, amongst other organizations. Homer was previously trauma director at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center and was a colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces with extensive experience in Afghanistan, former Yugoslavia, and with the Canadian Special Operations Forces. He still works clinically as a trauma surgeon, as an associate professor of surgery at the University of Toronto. Homer is currently leading one of the most complex medical deployments in Canadian history, Operation Remote Immunity, delivered with military precision by non-military personnel. It has proved to be successful and challenging. Engagement and shared control with local communities is key. So Dr. Teen, please.
Great. Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Dr. Mazurek, for inviting me to speak. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about Operation Remote Immunity. Let me see if I can advance them here. Why can I not advance them? Okay, great. And so my only disclosure is I'm the CEO of Orange, and so we're Ontario's air ambulance and critical care transport provider. And so I'm a paid executive of that organization, and it's a nonprofit from the and paid through the Ministry of Health in the province of Ontario. So just as a bit of a background, I guess with all the vaccine decisions that came for Canada and Ontario. Basically, I was asked to join a provincial vaccine distribution task force in December. They picked our former Chief of Defense Staff, General Rick Hillier, who I had the pleasure of serving under, and he was appointed at the end of November. And then the members were appointed on December the 4th. And it's one of those calls that I was thinking to myself, probably should refuse, but it's a very hard call to refuse. And so the appointment on the task force was really just to make recommendations about vaccine distribution. But I was then asked to lead Operation Remote Immunity on December 22nd, right before Christmas. And really the planning and then the actual operations sort of evolved from December 22nd of 2020. And so then the mission that was given to us was to complete the COVID-19 vaccinations for 31 remote flying Indigenous communities, plus one larger remote air accessible only municipality using the Moderna vaccine, 2 doses within a 4-month window. So starting with the planning on December 22nd and to be finished by sometime in mid-April. And so the objectives that I wanted to talk very quickly today are the challenges that, I was thinking about on December 22nd was where are we going to get our human health resources? Because this is going to be a full-time event. And what are some novel approaches we can consider? And obviously there's a long history of vaccine hesitancy everywhere. And I think Evita Lewis really highlighted some of the issues in some of the remote communities. And what I wanted to talk about was this idea of community outreach, ownership, and then what are the outcomes that come with this approach. And so in terms of the scope of the work, this is a map of Ontario, and these are the communities that we're talking about. There's 31 plus the municipality of Moosonee. These are the names of the Indigenous communities. And so from the top part, which is borders on Hudson Bay, are Fort Severn and Peawanuck. And from one of our major flight hubs, Fort Severn is about 860 kilometers one way. So the distances are fairly substantial. Most of these are gravel runways only. And I think both Dr. Mazurek and Evita talked a bit about some of the conditions on the ground in terms of water advisories and so forth. And so this was the scope of work that we were asked to do. And then there were certain general principles. And obviously, we were asked, and we have a very good relationship with one of the overarching political organizations that represents these communities, plus a series of road accessible communities as well. So obviously, we needed to have buy-in from the local leadership for all communities, and we needed to co-develop this plan with this political organization known as NAN. And because we're the air ambulance that services these areas, we actually have a very good working relationship with them in any case. We needed to protect the communities from importing COVID from our vaccinators. So we needed to make sure that we had a process that our vaccinators were doubly vaccinated, and we also had them tested before deploying at the hubs. We needed to make sure that they received cultural sensitivity training and were culturally competent. We had to have translation for all of our materials. And the initial plan was that, and it continues to be so, is that the communities don't have that many resources and they're very generous. And so we were asked not to deplete the community resources by asking them to host us in community. And so the parameters were that we needed to fly in and out daily. And so this is our general concept of operations. The arrival of the vaccine, and in Ontario, we've had numerous issues with the rollout and the availability of vaccine, both in Ontario and in Canada, was to arrive at a single distribution point. We were then responsible for developing the storage at 3 of our major air operations bases in Thunder Bay, Timmins, and Sioux Lookout, and we would have a secondary hub at Moosonee. So we had to ensure that the vaccine was flown in the right quantities to these locations with the appropriate security and refrigeration. And then we would base our teams out of these hubs. Luckily, we had a very involved whole of government affairs. So as I mentioned, Anishinaabe Aski Nation, we co-developed this plan with them and they were completely supportive. And up high, there were two major ministries at the provincial level that helped oversee this, which were Ministry of Health and the Solicitor General's Office, with Indigenous Affairs and Natural Resources being very helpful as well. Indigenous Services Canada were extremely helpful, and they were completely involved with some of the planning and the resources. We had some support from the Ontario Provincial Police, and the health authorities on the ground were in the Northwest, an organization called SLIFNA, and in the Northeast, an organization called WAHA. We're very involved at the community level, helping with the discussions on vaccine hesitancy. We have local resources in the in communities. There's this unit called the Canadian Rangers. It's not the same as the US Rangers. They're local Indigenous people who patrol the northern areas and have a lot of knowledge about living living on the ground, and actually help a lot with Canadian Armed Forces training in the north. The HHR that I'm going to talk a bit about were the use of faculty at medical schools and residents and medical students, which was some of our novel usage of human health resources. We developed an incident command structure. So I was the operation leader and I worked very closely with NAN to develop this. And you can see that overarching were the four ministries and the former chief of defense staff and lots of different partner organizations. So the basic organization, I spent some time with Canadian Special Forces, which was the model of a sort of a special forces organization where you have a task team lead, and we use that as an orange paramedic, a second in command with a responsibility for communications, administrations, and supplies, and then the actual people doing the work on the ground. Although the team lead and the two IC were obviously completely capable of doing vaccinations as well. And the deployment cycle was something that I used from our deployments in the military, which is the idea of there's a deployment date and you work backwards to D-2, D-1, and then there was a significant amount of training that was required. So the pre-deployment training was some of the PPE work, the community briefing, some cultural sensitivity that was expected to be done beforehand, operational briefing and review of documentation standards, and air safety as well. And then the ops days were planned for 5 days, with a sixth day as a possible weather day, and then or for a down day, and then we repeat the cycle as a D+6 or a D-1 for the next cycle. So then I'm going to talk a bit about community outreach, ownership, and outcomes. Obviously, parachuting a team into a community with no prep work is a recipe for disaster. And as we know, vaccine hesitancy and the acceptance of vaccine by a community needs to be prepared beforehand. So there was many levels of this. This is at one level where myself, the Deputy Minister for Indigenous Affairs, the NAN Grand Chief, the General Chief of Defense Staff, we would talk to all the communities every week. We had a schedule, but there were many other different types of these initiatives where both WAHA and SLIFNA, some of the health authorities on the ground were doing prep work. The docs in the communities were doing radio shows. There was a ton of social media, coordinated social media activity. And so it was sort of a full press court in terms of dealing with community hesitancy. In terms of the plan, as I said, coming up with the plan once the team arrived would be too late. So the general premise was that Orange, so my organization would have a task team lead and would organize with the community coordinator. And we had to arrange with the federal government to have the community coordinator paid. It's one of these things where everything is expected on volunteerism, but the communities would rightly ask, well, this is a fair bit of their time and it's a public health response. And so we arranged for funding for both the community coordinator and some of their admin staff through the federal government. And we arranged for activation of the Canadian Armed Forces to have their rangers on hand in every community. And so with all of these people, we were able to co-develop a plan for each of the communities that the community felt that they owned. It was their plan, not our plan. It was like not an orange plan. It was a total effort and a total plan. And the community coordinator was instrumental. That person identified the vulnerable that we would have to do home visits for. They helped with an engagement strategy. They helped coordinate the drivers and identify the central location, and they did the pre-setup. And so we had and this was my schedule for outreach over the Christmas holidays, but this was being done by all different organizations and on the social media as well. And it's still ongoing because we're still in the middle of ops. And so obviously we weren't able to finish all of the 31 communities because a lot of these represented more than one outreach activity. And so we're still in the midst of doing these outreach activities. But this is the result. You have a combined team, quite motivated, of Canadian Rangers in red, local healthcare staff, local community coordinators, our external staff, and really a whole team effort. And I think they're quite proud of the results that they've achieved. We also, from our HHR, we went to the universities. I'm faculty at U of T, but NOSM, the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, was a natural ask. Queen's University, their dean has a special affiliation with Anishinaabe Aski Nation, and U of T, as I'm faculty there, it was easy for me to reach out, and they have a very large number of people there. One of our paramedics is an instructor at Georgian College, and he reached out, so we were able to look at the use of paramedics students from Georgian College as well. And so this is sort of a look at our scheduling, and you can see that the universities play a huge role. Ad hoc just means there's different contract people, paramedic services that we're using. When I have the university, Queen's, NOSM, and U of T, they're not the only part of the team, but they're sending 4 people as part of a 6 to 7 people person team. And so they're playing a big part of our response to this problem. And part of the reason is it kept escalating. HHR was a big stress for me because we got the notice that we were taking the lead, and basically based on the need for pre-vaccinating everyone, I sort of decided that Feb 1st would be the start of operations. We had a soft launch with the Northeast because they had intrinsic healthcare resources, but we had to recruit and come up with a process for the Christmas holidays for everybody. And you can see where we requested the stop sign represents a time where we realized that for week 1, we weren't going to have everyone doubly vaccinated. And so I reached out to the dean at U of T to say, hey, I need some people who are vaccinated as part of their clinical responsibilities so that we can deploy on Feb 1st. And they've been superb with that. We had to do cultural competency training. So everyone did an 8-hour course on cultural competency on their own time. What was the experience like? So we're looking at gravel runways. It's the far north in Ontario. So there are small planes. You can see the types of planes we're using. The Twin Otter is a non-pressurized aircraft, so flying at low altitude. Some of them are pressurized. You can see in one community, the power went out, and so they were working by lamps and headlights, and they're doing community visits by truck or by foot in sort of the subarctic type temperatures. But community ownership lets you do a lot. So in 5 days, we would not have been able to set this up. So this is a completely community generated response where they've got the tentage, socially distanced admin desks, waiting, recess areas. And so the time spent on community ownership and outreach is well spent. And then they were very active on social media, talking about their personal experiences, about getting the vaccine, having leadership there, having ceremonies and blessings in each community before the vaccine started. So very much a community-run, community-led effort.
About 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you. And so this is an old slide, and I think I heard Evita, we're actually probably over 9,000 now, since Feb 1st, and we're moving along. And obviously there's been significant uptake in all of the communities. There's some things about data sharing, so I'm not going to go through the data by community. The community owns the data, but what I'll look at is some of the publicly posted stuff, which is in the public domain by the communities. And so in some of the communities, we're seeing substantial uptake. And part of the issue is, even if we think the uptake is less, the population estimates in the communities are from old data, and the chiefs actually have better data as to who's in community at the time that we arrive. So you see that we've got 96% uptake in this community called Muskrat Dam, and this gentleman, Roy Fiddler, tweeted that. The chief of the CEO of one of the health authorities in the Northeast are basically reporting well over 70% uptake in their large population centers. And you see that it's quite significant with this other community, about 90%, Niskandaga, on the bottom left. So the outcomes, I think, have been way more significant than we had hoped for, and certainly compared to previous influenza data, we're looking at significantly higher uptake in these communities. And then some of the other things that they're tweeting where, some very heartwarming stories, and this is my last slide, which is, one elder basically talked about the vaccine as, he thinks about as muskox, where the vulnerable muskox are in the middle, and then there's a ring of muskox protecting the elderly and vulnerable. And he sees that as the community's responsibility for their elder. And this tweet that he put out after we'd gone in was the uptake was huge, over 176,000 impressions. I think it was retweeted at the World Health Organization. It was just a lovely analogy of what vaccines can mean for a community. So I'll finish there. So thank you very much.
That's great, Dr. Teen. Thank you for presenting such a robust, complex, and successful program. Really, congratulations on that. It's outstanding. Okay, if I could ask Janet Gordon to please share your screen while I introduce you. Janet Gordon is currently the Chief Operating Officer with the Sioux Lookout First Nations Health Authority, an organization that serves 33 First Nations communities. She's originally from Casabonica Lake First Nation, but recently became a member of Lac Seul First Nation. Through her current work, she provides management, advocacy, and advisory support to health services and programs while striving for improved healthcare for First Nations in the Sioux Lookout area. With the guidance of the Anishinaabe Health Plan, she is currently working with key partners to transform the healthcare system for the First Nation communities served by SLF-NHA. She has worked with First Nations communities to prepare for and manage COVID outbreaks. When others offer help, she strives to ensure that consultation with local communities is the first step. Janet, the floor is yours. Janet, if you're speaking, you're on mute. Are you able to share your screen?
There we go.
I was looking for it and I can't find it. So I don't know if Lori or
Jeff, are you able to? Janet.
Okay, just hang on. Yeah, okay. And okay. Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Yes, thank you. Okay, so good morning, everybody. So I'm Janet Gordon. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Sioux Lookout First Nations Health Authority. Our main office is in Sulakot, and I oversee all the health services that are delivered or provided to the 31 communities. Sometimes we do also work with 3 of the communities that are around Dryden area, and mostly around public health activities. So I'm originally from Casablanca Lake First Nation, and now live in Sulakot and Lac Seul. So if we can go to the first slide, Jeff. So I just wanted Dr. Tan also showed a map of the great work that he did with the vaccination program. So these are the communities that we work with, mostly in Northwest Ontario, and so most of them, except for a handful, are 2 or 3 communities are drive-in, Lac Seul and Mishkegawgamag and New Slate Falls Gravel Road, but the rest are all remote communities and all fly-in communities. Next slide. So our healthcare system is certainly a fragmented best of times in terms of different people, different organizations and community. They have their own human resources that they're responsible for. So as an example, the healthcare system at the in the community is mainly a nursing station. This acts as a hub. And a lot that's where the nurses work from, and mostly hired by Indigenous Service Canada. There is one tribal council that have their own nurses and a couple of communities that hire their own nurses. Mostly all the community workers are hired at the community level. Some are at the nursing station, but others are working elsewhere in the community. And physicians are hired or contracted through Sulakot First Nations, Sulakot Regional Physician Services. And then there's us that hire other primary care providers like mental health workers and physio and other specialty areas like psychologists and stuff. So we and the tribal councils also have their own. So it's a really, I think, complex system of delivering healthcare to the communities. And like Dr. Tan said, there is infrastructure limitations where people work, as well as where people get accommodated if they want to provide service at the community level. So there has to be lots of coordination and I guess, supporting each other in determining what would be the priority. And other people like dentists and optometrists travel into the communities as well. So it's a busy part of community in terms of providing healthcare. Next slide. So we do have, fortunately for us, we did have certainly the beginning of establishing a public health system, which we call approaches to community well-being. So this is a model that we developed with the communities, and over the past 4 years, we've been developing it. And unfortunately, this relies on funding, and we just didn't have enough funding to develop the Safe Communities portion of our funding. we had started with raising our children, so preventing infectious diseases we had built up, and then some of the roots for the foundational stuff on roots for community well-being. But we hadn't done anything on safe communities. Next slide, please. So this is the safe community piece that we wanted to develop, and we just didn't have any resources to do this, but we had to do it when COVID hit. So we organized ourselves internally. We had to respond to our workplace, but we had to respond to communities' needs in making sure that there was plans in place, that there was, we had to develop policies, we had to develop educational material, and we had to also train people in dealing with COVID. So I just wanted to show this because we still have lots of work that we need to do around this area. And this is how we have been working with our public health model. Next slide. So in responding to COVID, the pandemic, we used the incident management system and our incident commander. And fortunately, we had a public health physician that was working for us. And so we put all these positions in place, but it was deployment of people within our organization that occupied these areas of responsibility. And this is only a small portion. I mean, there was lots of other people under all those areas that were part of those teams, and certainly had to have, sometimes daily meetings or weekly meetings in different areas. We had to, as an example, logistics, we had to respond to PPE requirements, and the planes were not flying, so we ended up setting a scheduled flight charters to all the communities to pick up tests, take supplies, and so it was busy year. We helped communities with proposal development, and of course all the planning areas and learning about COVID and putting things in place at the community level and within our organization. So we were able to train people in this system, and we started also training community pandemic teams, as well as some of the leadership leaders, chiefs or board members. And we're still doing that and continue to do that. Next. So in terms of just some examples, we talked a little bit about that. So we did a lot of coordination of meetings with our partners, tribal councils, communities. We started case and contact management of COVID. We were able to take that on for our communities. We did training and infection control, like I said, PPE, distribution, as well as training and managing it, and putting incident management systems in communities. And there's I think a double case and contact management, and doing surveillance and just having updates to the communities. We've had some cases in our communities, and we had to listen to the communities in terms of expectations, and we tried to respond in making sure that there was timely information sharing with the communities, and also other areas, point of care testing, isolation capacity, and then now we're supporting the COVID-19 immunization, the vaccination rollout program, and we'll continue to support that after the initial rollout of the vaccine. Next. So just in terms of moving forward from our learnings and from the work that we have done, we have developed an emergency response plan for our organization. We're moving forward and developing a regional response plan that will include all the communities, include other partners or identify other partners, and also to ensure that we're always part of that system, either regionally, nationally, or internationally, so that we are on top of a situation for our communities at all times. So that's, I guess, with us, the barriers are certainly work, the work structure, the accommodation of work, and accommodation for living is a big thing. Yeah, we are an organization that supports students. We are responsible for the management of physician services, so we support learners through that, and that we have taken public health students. We do psychologists that come in as interns, and but certainly with limitations that we have. But we certainly want to be considered as part of a public health system, and in terms of emergency response or anything that would happen in the communities, that we would always have a lead role in dealing with health, whether it's public health or acute medical care. And so that's it. I made my presentation really short. And thank you for listening to me. Migret.
So, sorry, go ahead, Greg, and then I've got one question because we are short on time.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say thank you very much, Jan. It was a very informative talk. Go ahead, Lori.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions put forward, and we will put them forward to the panel afterwards. We won't be able to answer them all now. But I do have a question. Sorry, I got to start my video here. It's probably to Homer with a very interested Janet listening in. Homer Operation Remote Immunity has been very successful deploying medical professionals and skilled learners to different regions in the north, in the most probably vulnerable communities. There is a very big concern about a third wave, and that third wave, as Evita has described, would be very impacting on northern communities, any community really. I think the south will probably hit hardest, but it means that in the north, they will be left to try and provide care longer than they might normally do. Do you think that the model for Operation Remote Immunity could be used as a model to build medical teams that respond to these communities to provide care in the communities while they're trying to wait for resources further south or opportunities to medically evacuate them? Is that an option, sort of almost like a Red Cross model of deployment? I don't know if Homer's on the line still.
Yeah, I am. It's a great question. That's a tough question. I guess it depends on the time horizon that we're looking at. So as you know, at Orange, we've developed a special operations type team that can go in on short notice to help with the management and resuscitation of someone until adequate transport has come. And we've been working with a surge aviation capability, with even so far as exercising with the Canadian Air Force with a C-130 with ambulance on it and a C-117 with ambulances on it. So I think it's a combination of if you're looking for high-level ICU care, it'd be very hard to have that at the nursing station. So I think it's about supporting the nursing stations. We're working with them about high flow and the transport of patients with high flow and minimizing the infection risk, surging a team in to help manage the patients until adequate transport, and then trying to get timely transport to southern ICUs. So there is a plan.
Yeah, I think having now worked in these communities, and Evita will say so too as well, and Janet's certainly an expert. I think there may well be a role for not maybe necessarily the highest acuity types of teams, but an intermediate team. I think, Janet, do you think that's even something that's deployable, feasible in the North? Should they be hit? Can communities support those kinds of teams coming in?
Certainly, we have supported the process that Dr. Tan talked about, and we tried to identify the equipment that should be up there. There has been some challenges around even storage of equipment up there, just because of just that infrastructure of the community is poor. There are some communities that are going to be receiving, I think, anywhere from 1 unit to 3 units. I think one community is getting the bigger communities, but they're supposed to be used for isolation units. A lot of communities also identified, like the school gym is probably the place where they would use it mainly for isolation, or the schools if they needed to. There certainly is a high turnover of nurses in the community. So if there was sort of that surge, some surge support, I think it could be something that could be looked at, especially if we had an outbreak that we're seeing, like the communities in northern Manitoba. And it could be something that could be looked at. Again, finding a place to rest your head even for a few hours could be problematic. So, and
bags in the floor.
Yeah. So I think there would be yeah.
Okay.
I hope
I
hope with the vaccination program that it's really successful in some communities, and it's gone over really well, I think. And in spite of the really cold weather that we had in February, I think it was crazy. Thank you. I shouldn't say that.
I really want to thank all the panelists. This has been very informative to a lot of people, from sharing the frontline experiences. And you could see for some, it was a very emotional experience to have to deal with that kind of really being overwhelmed and surrounded by death to that degree. Hopefully we will not see that. I think there's a great concern about the third wave and everywhere right now, and the variants and what kind of challenges it will bring. This webinar was created with that in mind, the idea that these are the people that are on this webinar are people who have shown leadership in this area, and really it's connecting you. All I am is a connector. I sort of feel like a spider with a web, is connecting the right people. I think you can share your ideas, and we need to have models that will support each other in the time of hardship. Like some people have already faced certainly more, and there's a concern that others will soon face that. And I think the global idea of or an idea of a global team is key. So I hope that people found the webinar useful. It's a long 3 hours, but we really super appreciate the people who attended and the people who participated. We'll follow up with the people who signed up for the webinar. The link will be posted, and outstanding questions, not that they're outstandingly good, but questions, they may be good too as well, will be circulated to the webinar speakers so that they have time to reflect. And I hope that this is really more of a step forward to further collaboration and team definition and just global sharing. So thank you again to Greg for hosting session 2 and for all the speakers, and Jeff Allen for keeping us on time and our webinar intact, with the one exception of Kirsten Johnson's webinar. We will be posting that separately and share everybody the link with that. So have a great day, evening, night, or morning, wherever you are in the world. People did sign in all from China, from Europe, from Africa, from the Middle East, and the US and Canada. So we did have quite a good cross-section of people. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll talk again.
Thanks, Lori.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Stay well.
Thanks, Lori.